They called it the Jerusalem of Lithuania, a city of books and music and laughter. But when the Nazis came, Vilna became something else entirely. A place where a whole world was murdered in the forest of Ponary, and yet, somehow, people still found the strength to resist. This is not just another Holocaust story. This is the story the Nazis tried to erase, the story they feared the most, because inside the Vilna Ghetto lived poets, teachers, children who whispered lessons underground, fighters who smuggled bullets and loaves of bread, and ordinary families who chose dignity even when stripped of everything else. And as you listen to this, you're about to step into a city where every street echoes with a last stand, where every corner hides a secret act of defiance, where every breath was borrowed time. What happened here is so shocking, so brutal, and yet so unbelievably courageous that once you enter the gates of the Vilna Ghetto, you will not look at the Holocaust the same way again. Chapter 1. The Jerusalem of Lithuania. They say that if you stood in the streets of Vilna on a quiet morning before the war, before the sky darkened with the shadows that would soon swallow Europe whole, you could hear something almost impossible now. Not just footsteps, or the clatter of carriages, or the soft clinking of shop shutters opening for the day, but the sound of the city thinking. Pages turning behind cracked apartment windows. Debates floating from cafes where students argued over literature and politics. Rabbis whispering ancient words as they walked to study halls. Even the wind seemed to carry ideas with it. Vilna was alive, restless, brilliant, hungry for knowledge. And no one could have imagined that the same streets would one day echo with boots, gunshots, and terrified whispers. But that day was coming, and it would arrive much sooner than anyone in this cultural paradise could believe. Before the war, Vilna was more than a city. It was a world, a universe of Jewish thought and creativity so vast that people across Europe called it the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Not because of its architecture or its climate or its politics, but because of its soul. This was a place where a young child might study Talmud in the morning, watch a Yiddish play at night, then overhear socialist students arguing with Zionist activists after dinner. Diversity was not a slogan here. It was the air people breathed. Every alleyway carried a different piece of the Jewish experience. Every courtyard held its own story. To walk through Vilna's Jewish quarter in the late 1930s was to move through a mosaic of languages and sounds. Yiddish was everywhere, melodic, sharp, expressive. It spilled out of bakeries, workshops, bookstores, and artist studios. Hebrew was the language of prayer and scholarship, reserved for the sacred, for the careful turning of parchments. Polish and Russian mixed in from the surrounding city, reminders of Vilna's complex political past. But Yiddish was the heartbeat. You could hear in the theaters most of all, where actors performed with the kind of raw emotion that came from centuries of storytelling under impossible conditions. These plays were not just entertainment. They were survival. They kept a culture alive. Vilna did not just admire books. It worshipped them. At the center of this devotion stood the Strachan Library, a treasure greater than any vault of gold. Inside its walls were tens of thousands of volumes, each carrying a fragment of Jewish history. Some books were so old their pages released the faint smell of ink and dust from forgotten centuries. Scholars treated them like living beings. Reading here was not a hobby. It was a calling, a sacred duty to preserve everything that came before. And the people of Vilna took that duty seriously. Around the library were smaller study rooms, schools, yeshivas that pulsed with energy from early morning until late at night. The sound of study, rapid, rhythmic, intense, poured out into the streets. Students sat hunched over wooden desks, their fingers stained with ink, arguing with each other with the kind of passion most people reserve for war. Every lesson was a battle of ideas. Every answer led to more questions. Learning was endless. And for these young minds, it was exhilarating. But Vilna was not only a city of scholars, it was a city of doers. Political movements thrived in its cafes and living rooms. Zionists dreamed of building a new home in Palestine. Bundists fought for Jewish workers' rights across Eastern Europe. Orthodox leaders argued for tradition, for heritage. Lovers of literature formed clubs that analyzed new writing line by line. Underground activists circulated newspapers forbidden by one government or another. It was messy, loud, sometimes chaotic, but it was alive in a way few places on earth have ever been. Markets buzzed with life. The aromas of baked bread, fresh fish, pickled vegetables, and sweet pastries mixed with the smell of coal smoke rising from chimneys. Children chased each other between crates of apples. Old men debated politics while leaning on canes. Women hurried through the streets with baskets of fruit. Horses clopped over cobblestones, their breath steaming in the cold. And above it all, the bells of churches and the songs of synagogues layered together in a strange harmony that belonged only to Vilna. Artists lived everywhere. Painters, musicians, poets. Their studios were small, drafty rooms with cracked walls and wooden floors that creaked under every step. But inside them, magic happened. Paintings of everyday life. Tailors at work, rabbis teaching, children reading on stoops, hung beside bold modernist experiments. Musicians practiced in cramped corners, their violins and clarinets filling the air with melodies that felt like laughter and grief woven together. Poets scribbled verses late into the night, their candles burning down to stubs. In Vilna, creativity was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Families were the heart of it all. Parents worked tirelessly. Tailors, cobblers, bakers, teachers, bookbinders, to give their children something better than what they had. Friday evenings were sacred. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the entire community seemed to slow. Windows glowed warm. The smell of challah drifted through corridors. Songs rose softly, one home after another, weaving a blanket of peace over the quarter. For a few hours, the chaos of the world outside disappeared. This was the rhythm of life. Predictable, comforting, deeply human. Yet beneath all that beauty, there was a tension, thin, almost invisible, but there. Europe was shifting. People whispered about rising hatred across the border. Newspapers printed strange, unsettling headlines from Germany. Refugees arrived from Poland with stories too disturbing to believe. Some dismissed them as exaggerations. Others felt a cold weight settle in their stomachs. But life continued, because what else could people do? You cannot stop a city from living simply because a storm is gathering somewhere far away. And no one fully understood the size of the storm that was coming. The political tension inside Vilna mirrored the growing chaos beyond its borders. Different groups argued fiercely about what the future might bring. Zionists warned of growing danger in Europe and urged young people to prepare for a world elsewhere. Bundists insisted that Jews must stay and fight for their rights in the countries they had lived in for centuries. Rabbis urged faith, tradition, and patience. Some were certain disaster was inevitable. Others believed civilization would prevail. But no one could agree on what to do. And while they argued, time slipped through their fingers. Still, life carried on with determined optimism. Schools opened every morning. Theaters filled their seats. Students filled libraries. Even the poorest families found moments of joy. Children playing with wooden toys in the street. Neighbors sharing warm meals. Young lovers meeting secretly behind market stalls to exchange hopeful promises of a future together. These were the moments that gave Vilna its heartbeat. In those final years before the war, perhaps no institution embodied Vilna's spirit more than its Yiddish theaters. They were loud, emotional, overflowing with life. Actors performed stories of love, exile, humor, and tragedy. Audiences laughed until they cried. Plays often lasted long into the night, and when people walked home afterward, the streets still hummed with energy. The performances felt like a celebration of survival, of culture, of identity. And though no one realized it at the time, many of those actors, musicians, and writers would soon perform their last roles, this time not on a stage, but in the darkest chapters of human history. Vilna's youth were especially full of energy. They organized clubs, sports leagues, reading circles. They hiked in the forests. They met in secret to discuss politics. Many dreamed of changing the world. Some imagined becoming doctors or lawyers or scholars. Others dreamed of building new nations, new societies, new lives. They were bold. They were confident. They believed the future belonged to them. And looking at the city around them, bright, intellectual, bustling, it was easy to believe they were right. But as 1940 approached, the whispers of danger grew louder. Refugees told stories of laws, restrictions, arrests. People spoke of Germany's expansion, of broken treaties, of neighbors vanishing in the night. Some in Vilna began storing food quietly, discreetly. Others discussed escape routes, visas, relatives abroad. Yet the community continued to celebrate holidays, to read and study, to live fully. Hope and fear lived side by side, each refusing to give in. Inside the Strashen library, scholars still studied ancient manuscripts. They traced faded Hebrew letters with their fingertips, unaware that soon they would be forced to hide these very treasures underground to save them from destruction. A sense of unease filled the reading rooms, but the scholars pushed it aside. Knowledge, after all, was eternal. Empires rose and fell. Wars began and ended. But books endured, or so they believed. Art continued too, but now some pieces carried darker themes. Painters captured the tension in people's faces. Poets wrote about uncertainty. Musicians composed melodies that felt like questions more than answers. Creativity became a way to confront fear, to make sense of an increasingly unstable world. Yet even in these moments, no one could fathom the scale of the catastrophe about to descend. Vilna's streets still bustled, but something had shifted, something subtle, like a warning in the wind. The political arguments became more heated. The cafes felt more crowded, as if people were afraid to be alone with their thoughts. And every so often, someone would mention the unthinkable. What if the storm was coming here? What if Vilna, the sanctuary of culture and learning, was not safe after all? By the spring of 1941, even the most optimistic residents felt a tightness in their chest. News of invasion, occupation, and persecution spread like wildfire across Europe. Each headline struck a little deeper. And in that quiet fear, the people of Vilna clung even tighter to their traditions, their learning, their laughter, as if holding on to them could somehow shield them. No one knew that the city's golden age was standing on its final edge. That within months, everything, the theaters, the libraries, the study halls, the bustling markets, the laughter of children, would be crushed under the weight of an unimaginable horror. No one knew that the same scholars reading peacefully in the Strashen library would soon be forced to decide whether to save their books or save their lives. No one knew that the streets filled with music would soon be patrolled by armed men barking orders in a language of death. And as the summer of 1941 approached, the storm that had only whispered from afar finally began to roar. The roads leading to Vilna trembled under the movement of armies. Borders collapsed. Rumors turned into certainty. And the people who had once believed their city was untouchable now stood unknowingly on the edge of an abyss. The Jerusalem of Lithuania was about to face its darkest hour. Chapter 2. The Nazi Invasion and the Fall of Vilnius. It began before dawn, before the city had even opened its eyes. A low, distant rumble, so faint it could have been mistaken for thunder, crept across the eastern sky. But there were no clouds, no storm, just a sound that didn't belong to nature. A strange vibration that made windows tremble and startled birds from the rooftops. And then, as the sun rose over Vilnius on that June morning in 1941, the rumble grew into a roar. Engines, hundreds of them, tanks, motorcycles, trucks, the kind of sound that meant only one thing. War had arrived. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and Vilna was about to plunge into a nightmare from which it would never awaken. People rushed into the streets, still half asleep, their faces pale with confusion. They looked eastward, shading their eyes from the early light, trying to understand what was happening. Some had heard rumors, whispers of Hitler preparing to betray Stalin, of an invasion that would tear open the entire Eastern Front. But rumors always seemed distant, abstract, until the ground itself shook, until the smell of diesel drifted in like poison, until the first German aircraft screamed overhead, so low the rooftops seemed to tremble under their wings. Within hours, the sky above Vilna was a battlefield of its own. Soviet planes scrambled desperately to defend the city, but they were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outpowered. Black smoke spiraled upward as one Soviet aircraft after another fell in flames beyond the river, crashing into fields or exploding in midair. People watched in horror as burning debris rained down, the metal glowing orange from the heat. They covered their ears against the explosions, but the sound forced its way in anyway. Deep, booming, relentless. The Soviet soldiers stationed in the city were caught completely off guard. Many were young, barely trained, and terrified. They scrambled through the streets, trying to organize some kind of defense, but confusion spread faster than orders. Trucks roared past carrying hastily loaded equipment. Officers shouted instructions that contradicted one another. Civilians huddled in doorways or crowded into basements as stray bullets whizzed overhead. Within a single day, the Soviet defense began to crumble, and by the second day, it was collapsing completely. The Germans moved with terrifying speed, slicing through the region like a blade through cloth. And with the chaos of invasion came something even darker, something far older than war. As soon as Soviet forces withdrew, Lithuanian militias, nationalists, and opportunists emerged from hiding, many of them carrying a hatred that had been simmering beneath the surface. They seized the moment. They grabbed rifles, clubs, knives, anything they could find, and turned their fury on their Jewish neighbors. Pogroms erupted not because the Germans ordered them, though the Germans encouraged them, but because these men had been waiting for this chance. In the towns around Vilna, Jewish families were dragged from their homes, beaten in the streets, humiliated, and murdered in scenes of unimaginable cruelty. News of these atrocities reached Vilna quickly. Refugees stumbled into the city bruised, bleeding, trembling. They spoke of homes burned down, of synagogues desecrated, of men shot in front of their children. Their words spilled out in fragments, choked by shock. And yet even then, some people in Vilna struggled to believe it. After all, they told themselves, this was Vilna, the cultural heart of Jewish Europe. Surely it would be protected by its history, its dignity, its beauty. They clung to that hope, fragile as it was. But that illusion shattered the moment the Germans entered the city. On June 24th, German soldiers marched through Vilna's gates with rifles slung across their backs, boots hitting the cobblestones in perfect, terrifying rhythm. Civilians watched from windows as soldiers raised swastika flags over government buildings, over police stations, over radio towers. Within hours, the occupiers established checkpoints, set up curfews, and declared the city under complete German control. The occupation was ruthless from the very first day. The Jewish population of Vilna, more than 60,000 people, felt the weight of this new reality instantly. German soldiers stormed Jewish shops, smashing windows and dragging owners into the streets. They tore beards from elderly men, beat rabbis in public squares, and forced Jews to scrub sidewalks while bystanders laughed or looked away in silence. The atmosphere shifted with terrifying speed. Where once there had been culture, learning, and debate, now there was fear. Heavy, suffocating fear. And then came the orders. Jews had to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David, visible at all times. Jews were banned from using public transportation. Jews were forbidden from walking on certain streets. Jews could not buy from non-Jewish stores. Jews were barred from parks and marketplaces. Jews could be arrested for anything or for nothing at all. The laws came daily, sometimes hourly, printed in German and Lithuanian, posted on walls, and shouted through megaphones. A new world was being constructed, one in which Jewish life was already marked for extinction. But the darkest element of the occupation began outside the city, hidden beyond a small forest called Ponary. Ponary was a quiet place once, a patch of pine trees and sandy soil, just a short journey from Vilna. The Soviets had begun digging large pits there months earlier for fuel storage tanks, but never finished the project. Now those pits would become something unimaginable. As the Germans consolidated control over Vilna, they began transporting Jews, men at first, then women, then entire families, toward Ponary under the pretense of relocating them for work or questioning. Many walked willingly, believing the lie. Others were forced at gunpoint. What awaited them in those pits was execution. Mass execution. Day after day, week after week, truckloads of Jews were brought to the edge of those sandy craters, forced to undress, and shot by German soldiers and Lithuanian collaborators from the Ypatingasis berries. The killers worked with chilling efficiency. Bodies tumbled into the pits, layers upon layers. Sometimes the victims were still breathing when dirt was shoveled over them. The forest swallowed their screams. The people in Vilna sensed something horrible was happening, but the truth felt too immense, too monstrous to grasp. Families whispered of neighbors who had vanished, workers who left for labor assignments and never returned, young men who were arrested and never seen again. The fear spread through the streets like smoke. Inside the city, Jewish life constricted. German commanders ordered mass roundups. They raided apartments at dawn, pulling men from their beds. They targeted intellectuals first, rabbis, teachers, political leaders, scholars from the Strashon library, hoping to break the community's spirit by removing its mind. They succeeded. The absence of these leaders left a void so deep the city felt hollow. By July, the streets were patrolled not only by German soldiers, but by Lithuanian police eager to prove their loyalty to the new regime. These patrols stormed Jewish homes under the flimsiest pretexts. They demanded valuables, money, gold, watches, jewelry, and beat anyone who hesitated. The sound of fists hammering on doors at midnight became a constant terror. Mothers clutched their children. Fathers pressed their ears to the walls, listening for footsteps on the stairs. Every night could be the night everything ended. And yet, amidst the horror, people tried to cling to traces of normal life. Children still ran briefly in courtyards, though never far from their parents' sight. Some shops reopened, their shelves half empty but still offering a sense of routine. Teachers met students in secret to continue lessons, whispering Hebrew letters in basements lit only by a single candle. But the city's rhythm had changed. Every moment felt like borrowed time. German propaganda flooded the city, painting Jews as enemies of the Reich, parasites, traitors. Posters showed grotesque caricatures, spreading poison into the minds of the population. And while many Lithuanians resisted this hatred, many others embraced it. Decades of anti-Semitism had created fertile ground for the Nazis' message. Jews could feel the change in the air. They were no longer neighbors. They were targets. Throughout July and August, the killings escalated. Entire groups of Jewish men were marched out of the city and slaughtered in Ponary. By late summer, the Germans shifted strategy. Men were no longer enough. They wanted women, children, elderly, anyone who could not work, anyone who might slow down the machine of extermination. On some days, the trucks left Vilna, filled with hundreds. On others, large columns of Jews were forced to walk the long road to Ponary, guarded by Lithuanian auxiliaries armed with rifles. Survivors remembered the silence more than anything. The fear was so dense that people could barely speak. They marched past farms and villages, past people who watched from their windows without saying a word. Some villagers waved. Others laughed. Most simply watched, as if witnessing a procession of ghosts. And still, no ghetto existed yet. The Germans had not even begun the process of forcing Jews into a confined district. They were thinning the population first, eliminating anyone they deemed unnecessary, killing before organizing, murder before containment. Amid the terror, one building remained painfully symbolic, the Strashon library. Its scholars were murdered or arrested, its books confiscated, its shelves torn apart by German soldiers who had no understanding of what they were destroying. Priceless manuscripts were thrown into piles, trampled under boots, or shipped to Germany as trophies. The heart of Vilna's intellectual life was being dismantled page by page, word by word, and nothing could stop it. Rumors began circulating in late August. Whispers that the Germans planned to create a sealed-off district, an area Jews would be forced into, surrounded by guards, cut off from the rest of the city. A ghetto. The word carried dread. People knew what ghettos meant. Disease, starvation, isolation, and eventually, death. But even that seemed, for some, preferable to the chaos of the streets. At least in a ghetto, families might remain together. At least in a ghetto, there might be a sliver of safety. But deep down, everyone knew safety was an illusion. As September approached, the streets of Vilna felt heavier, darker. The air tasted metallic, thick with uncertainty. No one knew how many Jews had been killed so far, thousands, certainly, but the truth was too terrifying to count. What people didn't know was that the world they once lived in was gone, erased, replaced by a nightmare that grew worse with each passing day. And then, on a day that began like any other, German loudspeakers blared through the streets announcing the order that would change everything. All Jews were to prepare for relocation. They were to gather their belongings. They were to report to designated points. They were to follow instructions without resistance. The ghetto was coming. And the people of Vilna had no idea that this was only the beginning of horrors far deeper than they yet imagined. Chapter 3. Ponary, the killing fields. They did not know where the trucks were going the first time. They had no map of the road ahead, no warning of what waited beyond the trees, no reason to suspect that the forest stretching quietly outside Vilna would become the largest Jewish graveyard in Lithuania. The convoys rolled out at dawn under a sky that looked almost peaceful, soft light, still air, the early breath of summer drifting across the sand. And yet, beneath that calm, something monstrous had already awakened. The pits dug months earlier by the Soviets, meant for fuel tanks that were never installed, now lay open like wounds in the ground. Deep, wide, yawning holes in the earth that would swallow tens of thousands of Jews, one bullet, one scream, one heartbeat at a time. The first victims thought they were being taken for work. German officers told them so. Lithuanian police repeated the lie. Many believed it because they wanted to believe it. Hope was a fragile tether they could not afford to cut. Families packed small bags. Men wore coats even in the warmth of June, thinking the labor camp might be cold. Some said goodbye to their loved ones calmly, promising to return soon. A few mothers whispered blessings into their sons' ears. And in the still dark morning, the trucks pulled away, their engines growling as they drove down the dirt road toward a patch of forest called Ponary. Ponary had always been quiet. Pine trees stood straight and tall, their needles whispering in the wind. A sandy path wound between them, soft underfoot, carrying the scent of resin and earth. Birds sang overhead. For generations, it had been a place for picnics, long walks, moments of peace. But the forest changed once the Germans arrived. The air felt heavier. The birds flew farther from the pits. The silence grew unnaturally thick, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. The truck stopped just outside the trees, where armed Lithuanian collaborators, men from the Ypatingusis berries, waited. There were local volunteers, many driven by anti-Semitism, others by opportunity, a few simply by obedience. Whatever their reasons, they became the Germans' most efficient instruments of murder. They shouted at the Jews to get out, to form lines, to march. Some victims hesitated. They were struck with rifle butts. Others complied immediately, still clinging to the story of work assignments. But nothing about the scene looked like work. The forest smelled of fear, sweat, and the faint metallic sting of old blood soaked into the soil. At the edge of the pits, the truth became impossible to deny. People saw the mounds of clothing, the scattered shoes, the torn shirts, the piles of discarded prayer books, the trails of dry blood. The victims froze, unable to breathe. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men clenched their fists, though they knew there was no escape. Some fell to their knees. Others began to scream, but the guards were unmoved. They ordered the Jews to undress. Completely. Fold their clothes. Step forward. Stand at the edge. There were no explanations, only commands. The execution squads operated with brutal, methodical precision. A small group of victims was led to the rim of the pit. They were lined up in tight rows, shoulder to shoulder. The ground beneath them shifted slightly, as if resisting the weight. German officers supervised while Lithuanian shooters carried out the killings. The victims were shot in the back of the head or the neck, one after another, collapsing like falling timber. Their bodies tumbled into the pit, hitting those who had already fallen. Some were still alive, gasping, bleeding, trying to crawl. They were buried anyway. Dirt rained down over them as the next group was brought forward. The screams echoed through the forest, but never reached the city. The trees absorbed them. The pits swallowed them. The world remained indifferent. Back in Vilna, families waited for news. They tried to stay hopeful, telling themselves that the silence was simply a delay. But soon enough, whispers began circulating, whispers of killing ground. Survivors, witnesses, Polish locals who heard the gunshots, Lithuanian civilians forced to transport corpses. Word spread from one terrified home to another. Ponary was not a work site. It was a slaughterhouse. As the days passed, the killings intensified. The Germans wanted to eliminate anyone they considered unproductive or dangerous. Educated Jews, rabbis, teachers, political leaders, men captured during roundups, anyone they suspected of having influence. Whole groups were arrested and sent directly to Ponary. No trial, no explanation, no mercy. The community felt the loss instantly. Families were torn apart. Women searched for their husbands, their sons, their brothers, walking from one police station to another only to be told nothing. Or worse, told to stop asking questions. By late July, the Germans decided that killing only men was not enough. Women were added to the transports. Then children, babies, elderly grandmothers who could barely walk. They were herded onto trucks or forced to march along the sandy road under the watch of Lithuanian guards. Some dropped from exhaustion. They were shot on the spot. Others tried to run. They were hunted down like animals. The march itself became a ritual of terror. The victims walked through villages where locals watched silently from windows. Some whispered prayers. Others wept without making a sound. Inside Ponary, the killing pits grew deeper. The bodies mounted. The smell of decay mingled with the scent of pine until the forest felt haunted by death itself. Witnesses later describe how the soil around the pits seemed to move after executions. Tiny shifts, slight tremors, as those buried alive struggled for breath. Some clawed at the sand until their fingers bled. But the weight of the corpses above them made escape impossible. The German officers drinking nearby took little notice. They smoked. They chatted. They joked. For them, this was routine. By August, Ponary had become a killing machine. The Germans and their collaborators kept meticulous lists of those taken, at first. But soon there were too many. Too many names. Too many bodies. Record-keeping became redundant. They simply killed whoever they captured. The forest became a grave for Jews from Vilna, but also for Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and anyone else the Nazis deemed undesirable. Groups of men from the Ypatingasis berries carried out most of the executions. They arrived drunk, eager, proud of their brutality. Some posed for photographs. Others collected valuables from the victims, rings, watches, necklaces, before shooting them. Their cruelty was fueled by hate, greed, and the intoxicating power of absolute control. And yet, the Germans treated them as tools, replaceable and expendable. Even the killers were trapped in a cycle of violence that stripped them of their humanity. The Jews who remained in Vilna lived with the constant dread of Ponary. Every sound outside their window felt like an omen. Every knock on the door made their blood run cold. Mothers slept with their children in their arms, afraid they might wake up alone. Men stayed awake through the night, listening for footsteps on the stairs. And every time someone disappeared, the same terrible question followed. Will they return? Or have they gone to the forest? Rumors ran wild. Some said the Germans planned to expand the killing operations. Others said the pits were already overflowing. There were even stories, whispered in the darkest corners, that some victims had managed to escape by playing dead under the bodies, crawling out at night. These tales spread like sparks through dry grass, igniting a faint, desperate hope. But for every story of escape, there were hundreds of confirmed deaths. Hope was always overshadowed by grief. In early September, the nature of the violence began to change yet again. The Germans realized that ad hoc executions were not enough. They wanted structure, control, efficiency. The liquidations had thinned Vilna's Jewish population, but the community was still too large, too scattered, too unpredictable. They needed a way to isolate the Jews, to contain them, to make them easier to kill later. That meant one thing: a ghetto. For the Jews of Vilna, the announcement of the ghetto came like a second wave of shock. Many thought the Germans' worst actions were already behind them. They believed the occupation might stabilize. But the order to relocate made it clear this was not stabilization. It was preparation, a step towards something far more horrific. As the creation of the ghetto approached, the killings in Ponary escalated. The Germans wanted to remove anyone they considered a burden before confining the rest. Young men were targeted because they were seen as potential resistance fighters. Elderly people were taken because they were deemed useless. Women with many children were singled out because the Nazis believed they would not work efficiently. The brutality was random and calculated at the same time. Witnesses described the roads leading to Ponary as covered with footprints, some small, some large, some dragging, some running. Each one a story cut short. Sometimes, abandoned children wandered back to Vilna alone, their clothes torn, their eyes hollow. They could barely explain what had happened. They had seen soldiers. They had seen pits. They had heard gunshots. And then they had run. Their words were fragmented, but their terror was unmistakable. As autumn approached, the forest grew colder. Dew settled on the pine needles. The ground hardened at night. But the killings continued with the same relentless pace. Now the victims shivered as they undressed, their breath fogged in the air, their bare feet pressed against the cold sand. The shooters barely noticed. To them, death was routine, seasonless, mechanical. Inside the pits, bodies piled upon bodies. Layers of the dead formed a grotesque stratigraphy. Men on top of boys, women on top of infants. The forest became a mass grave, so vast it reshaped the landscape. The sandy soil shifted underfoot. The air grew thick with the smell of death. Survivors who passed through the area years later said they could feel the weight of the lost pressing against their skin like an invisible fog. Ponary was not merely a site of murder. It was the preface to genocide, a rehearsal for the destruction of the entire Jewish community of Vilna. And the Germans were not finished. In the final days before the ghetto was established, the killings peaked. Trucks filled with Jews left the city daily. Some victims were taken during raids. Others were seized on the streets. Some families were told they were being relocated and walked willingly toward the forest. Others were beaten and dragged. The killings blurred together until the forest itself seemed to pulse with suffering. And then, abruptly, the pace slowed. Not because the Germans felt mercy, but because they had something else planned. Something larger. Something more systematic. They were preparing to seal the Jews of Vilna inside the ghetto. Ponary would continue to kill, but now the ghetto would feed it. As the order for relocation spread through Vilna, the Jews understood that they were being herded towards something terrible. They just did not know how terrible. They did not know how much worse than Ponary the future would become. But they would learn. In the days ahead, the gates of the ghetto would close. The nightmare would intensify, and the forest would keep waiting, silent and hungry, for those it had not yet claimed. Chapter 4. Establishment of the Vilna Ghetto. It happened quickly, so quickly that many people didn't even understand what was unfolding until it was already too late. One morning, the familiar streets of Vilna still felt like home. Dangerous, yes, haunted by disappearances and the constant fear of Ponary, but still home. By nightfall, those same streets had become corridors of panic, lined with German soldiers barking orders, Lithuanian police swinging rifle butts like hammers, families spilling into the cold air with only what they could carry, and the impossible realization that an entire world was being herded toward extinction. The order had come down. The Jews of Vilna were to be relocated into a designated district, a ghetto. And in that single word, people could already hear the echo of something much vaster, darker, and deadlier than anything they had yet endured. The announcement was delivered the way all Nazi orders were delivered. Loudspeakers, posters, shouting patrols, and the sudden tightening of the noose around Jewish life. Jews were commanded to leave their homes immediately. They were told they could bring only what they could carry in their arms. Everything else, furniture, heirlooms, dishes, books, clothing, memories, would remain behind, or be stolen, or destroyed. The city that had once been the Jerusalem of Lithuania now watched its Jewish residents pour into the streets with bundles, blankets, children half asleep in their arms, old men leaning on trembling canes. The roads looked like a river of fear. People moved in waves, some crying, others silent, some shouting prayers, others staring ahead with empty eyes. Mothers carried their youngest children as if their arms could protect them from the future. Fathers walked with stiff chests, trying to project strength even as terror gnawed at their insides. The elderly shuffled slowly, pausing to catch their breath, their faces etched with disbelief. This was not the city they knew. This was not the world they recognized. Vilna had changed. Everything had changed. German troops directed the crowds with cold efficiency. Lithuanian auxiliary police assisted eagerly, pushing families down certain streets, shouting when someone hesitated, striking those who moved too slowly. The shove of a rifle but became a kind of punctuation. Move, 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 forcing the crowd forward. Dogs barked. Babies screamed. The sound of boots echoed through alleys where scholars once debated and children once played. Every sound carried the same message. There was no choice anymore. Only obedience. Only survival. The chosen district for the ghetto was the old Jewish quarter. Narrow streets, aging buildings, tiny courtyards that had once been full of life. Now those same streets would become cages. But the Germans did not create one ghetto. They created two. Ghetto number 1 for those deemed useful. Ghetto number 2 for those deemed unproductive. The Germans didn't bother explaining what those terms meant, but the people understood soon enough. Families were torn apart at the checkpoints. A guard would glance at a man's hands. Calloused? Into Ghetto 1. Soft? Into Ghetto 2. A woman with many children might be pushed to Ghetto 2. A young man in good health to Ghetto 1. Elderly parents and their adult children separated in seconds. The Germans made these decisions casually, carelessly, with the detached cruelty of men sorting livestock. People screamed names across the barriers. Fathers tried to break through to reach their sons. Mothers begged soldiers to reconsider. No one listened. No one cared. Ghetto 2 did not last long. It was a death sentence wearing the disguise of a relocation. Within days, nearly everyone inside it was marched to Ponary and murdered. The Germans had created it only to accelerate the killing. In Vilna, the phrase Ghetto 2 became synonymous with doom. Families prayed they would be sent to Ghetto 1 not because it was safe. It wasn't, but because at least it offered the illusion of time. Inside Ghetto 1, chaos reigned from the first moment. Thousands of people poured through its gates, each clutching the fragments of a life that no longer existed. Streets meant for a few hundred residents now held thousands. Every building overflowed. Apartments built for a single family were now crowded with 5, 6, sometimes 10 families. People slept on floors, on tabletops, on stairwells. The smell of sweat, smoke, damp clothing, and human fear hung thick in the air. Windows rattled from the press of bodies. Children cried from hunger. Elderly men collapsed in doorways, too weak to continue. But the shock of overcrowding was nothing compared to the shock of loss. The moment the ghetto gates closed, everything outside them was gone. Homes, businesses, photographs left behind on mantels, wedding rings stored in desk drawers, prayer shawls folded neatly in closets, the piano that a family's daughter had practiced on every evening, the stack of books a scholar had spent a lifetime collecting, all of it lost in an instant. The world outside the ghetto was no longer theirs. They had been erased from the city they had built. The Judenrat, Jewish Council, was formed almost immediately. The Germans appointed Jacob Jens, a man who walked with the bearing of a soldier and the caution of someone who understood the deadly game he was being forced to play. Jens believed, or desperately hoped, that the only chance for survival was proving that Jews were essential to the German war machine. Work, he said, is our only way to live. It was a philosophy forged in terror, a calculation made at the edge of annihilation. Not everyone agreed with him. Some called him a collaborator. Others saw him as a protector force to make impossible choices. But in the ghetto, moral clarity dissolved quickly. Every decision felt like a gamble between life and death. Under Jen's leadership, the ghetto was organized into a fragile structure of order. Housing committees, labor offices, sanitation teams, makeshift hospitals. People scavenged for nails and wood to repair broken doors. They ripped bedsheets into bandages. They turned old studios into kitchens, courtyards into meeting areas, basements into classrooms. Nothing was stable, nothing safe, but they tried. Because trying meant resisting the collapse that threatened to swallow them. Daily life inside the ghetto balanced on a knife's edge. Food was scarce. The Germans allowed rations so small they barely kept anyone alive. A loaf of bread had to be stretched over days. Potatoes were gold. Soup made from cabbage, water, and nothing else became a meal. Hunger gnawed at everyone. Children's faces grew hollow. Adults' belts needed new holes. Even the strongest men staggered from weakness. And the Germans did not care. Starvation was part of the plan. Disease spread through the ghetto as fast as rumors. Typhus lurked in every crowded room. The air tasted of sickness. Doctors did what they could, but medicine was scarce. Some patients lay on floors because there were no beds. Others died at home because they feared going to the hospital. It was too visible, too risky, too easy for the Germans to target. Life became a constant negotiation with death. Yet somehow, in this hell, the people of Vilna refused to surrender the last shreds of their humanity. Teachers held classes in secret, whispering lessons in small groups. Children learned letters traced in dust or chalk. When supplies were gone, they memorized instead. Knowledge became both weapon and comfort. Rabbis taught prayers in hidden rooms lit by candles whose flames flickered like fragile hope. Musicians played softly on rescued instruments, their notes drifting through the night like ghosts of the world that once existed. And in the center of the ghetto stood the remains of the Strashen Library. Its shelves were incomplete, its manuscripts looted, its scholars gone, but it was still there. Survivors gathered within its battered walls, reading whatever remained, preserving words in their minds because they feared the pages would not survive. A few librarians smuggled precious books into hiding, risking execution to save the past. These quiet acts of defiance became some of the most powerful forms of resistance the ghetto ever produced. But the ghetto was not only home to scholars, teachers, and families. It became home to something else too, something born from desperation and fueled by the knowledge of what Ponary truly was. Young men and women, some barely adults, formed secret groups dedicated to resistance. Their whispers spread through the ghetto like sparks. Do not believe the Germans. Do not trust their promises. Ponary is not a work camp. Ponary is death. They gathered in attics, basements, abandoned workshops. They smuggled weapons through the fences, hid bullets and bread, passed coded messages hand to hand. They waited for a chance, any chance to rebel. But rebellion would come later. For now, every resident of the ghetto was struggling just to survive the transition into captivity. The Germans enforced strict boundaries. Patrols circled the walls. Anyone caught crossing was shot. Anyone found near the edge without permission was beaten or arrested. The ghetto became a kind of island, surrounded by the ocean of an occupied city that had turned hostile overnight. Life inside the walls developed its own rules. People were assigned to workshops, factories, sewing centers, carpentry shops. Work permits became more precious than food. A permit meant survival, temporary survival, but survival nonetheless. Without one, the Germans might deport you at any moment. People forged permits. They traded for them. They bribed guards. They begged gens for assignments. Families clung to these papers as if they were life preservers in a storm. Every morning before sunrise, labor brigades lined up at the gates. Guards inspected their permits, then marched them out to work sites across the city: warehouses, factories, road crews, cleaning squads. Jews repaired buildings the Germans needed, cleaned streets the soldiers dirted, carried supplies for the very forces destroying their lives. Those who worked well might survive another day. Those who stumbled or collapsed might never return. Still, even within this system, there were slivers of resistance. Workers sabotaged equipment. Teachers smuggled notes. Partisans gathered intelligence. Mothers traded secrets and food in hushed voices. It was a delicate dance, survival through obedience, survival through defiance. But no one forgot Ponary. Ponary was the shadow hanging over every action, every breath. People could hear rumors of new shootings. They saw the empty spaces left by neighbors who had been taken for questioning. They walked by the gates and saw German trucks idling, engines warm, waiting for their next human cargo. The forest loomed like an open mouth. As the weeks passed, the ghetto became a paradox, full of life and full of death. Children played games in alleys because they had forgotten what freedom looked like. Couples whispered promises under blankets. Friends laughed quietly, remembering old jokes. Life persisted because that is what life does. But underneath every moment was a question too heavy to speak. How long can this last? By the end of September, the ghetto was sealed completely. No one entered. No one left. The walls felt tighter than ever, as if the entire district had been swallowed into the bowels of the city. But the worst part, the part no one wanted to admit, was that the sealing of the ghetto meant the Germans were ready for the next stage. The killings would not stop. They would simply change form. The people trapped inside Vilna's ghetto did not yet know how catastrophic the coming months would be. They did not know about the future roundups, the action that would tear families apart in minutes. They did not know that Ponary would continue to devour thousands more. They did not know that even the ghetto's leaders, those desperately trying to save as many lives as possible, would be forced into choices so impossible they would haunt history. But they didn't know this. The gates had closed, and with them, the life of Vilna as they had known it. The laughter, the music, the debates, the theaters, the libraries, the culture, had been sealed away forever. They were trapped now, trapped in a shrinking world surrounded by soldiers and death. And though they could not see it yet, the next chapter of this nightmare was already beginning to unfold in the darkness beyond the walls. Chapter 5. Daily Life Under Terror. They woke each morning not to sunlight or the sound of birds or the promise of a new day, but to the weight of hunger pressing against their ribs and the quiet terror that someone they loved might be missing. Dawn in the Vilna Ghetto did not bring hope. It brought inspection. German patrols walking the perimeter. Lithuanian police stamping their boots outside the gates. The muffled coughs of children already weakened by hunger. Every morning began with the same grim realization. You had survived the night, but the day ahead might crush you. And still, somehow, people rose. They dressed. They stepped into the narrow streets and tried to build a life out of ruins. Not because they believed they could win, but because the alternative was to let the ghetto devour them from the inside. The first thing you noticed when you walked through the ghetto at daybreak was the smell. A mix of smoke from makeshift stoves, rotting refuse in overcrowded alleys, stale air trapped between buildings, the sour tang of illness spreading from homes where people had been bedridden for days. The scent was a constant reminder that too many bodies, too little space, and too little food created an environment no one was meant to survive in. And yet, The streets were always alive with movement. Children carrying tin cups to fetch watery soup. Elderly men leaning on canes, struggling to keep up with the crowd. Women tightening scarves around their heads, their faces thin and lined with exhaustion. Every person carried the same hollow look, eyes searching for something that had long vanished. Food was the dictator of daily life. It ruled everything. People measured time, not in hours or minutes, but in the distance between one meager meal and the next. The Germans issued rations that barely reached a few hundred calories a day, grotesquely insufficient for survival. A loaf of coarse bread might have to feed an entire family for nearly a week. Thin slices, cut with trembling hands, were distributed with the precision of a jeweler cutting diamonds. Every crumb mattered. Children licked plates clean. Adults pretended they were not hungry, so the young could eat more. The elderly tightened their belts until the leather dug into their skin. Soup kitchens became the heartbeat of the ghetto. A pot of boiling water mixed with cabbage leaves, turnips, and sometimes nothing more than salt was ladled out to long lines of desperate people. The smell of that thin soup, barely more than flavored water, floated through the streets like a cruel taunt. Children clutched empty metal bowls with white-knuckled fingers, hoping there would still be something left when their turn came. And when the pot finally ran out, the silence that fell over the courtyard felt like mourning. Black markets, though forbidden, thrived in the shadows. They were pockets of quiet rebellion. Jews smuggling food from outside the ghetto through holes in fences, bribing guards, risking death for a handful of potatoes or a piece of bread. Mothers traded cherished heirlooms, rings, earrings, silver candlesticks, for a few scraps of meat. Fathers exchanged their coats for a sack of flour. Every deal was dangerous. Every trade came with the risk of being caught by German or Lithuanian patrols. But hunger does not negotiate with fear. Hunger wins. Yet even in the midst of starvation, the human instinct to create order remained. Families rearranged cramped rooms into living spaces that felt as normal as possible. A corner for sleeping, a shelf for belongings, a blanket hung over a doorway to create privacy. People decorated walls with scraps of fabric or faded photographs they had managed to save. These gestures were not foolish optimism. They were defiance, a refusal to let the ghetto erase their humanity. Work dominated the days. Jews with labor permits, precious, life-saving documents, were forced to report to the gates before sunrise. They marched out under guard, heads down, pockets empty, knowing that one wrong move, one incorrect word, one moment of stumbling from exhaustion could cost them their lives. They repaired roads, shoveled snow, dug ditches, cleaned barracks, and carried heavy loads for German troops. They were beaten for working too slowly, shouted at for working too quickly. Their effort did not determine their safety. Only German women did. But a work permit bought time, and time was survival. Inside the ghetto, workshops filled the air with the clatter of tools and the hum of forced industry. Tailors stitched uniforms for German soldiers. Shoemakers repaired boots. Carpenters built crates and furniture. Even children worked, bending over sewing tables until their backs ached. These workplaces were bitter paradoxes. They were prisons, but they were also shelters. A person who worked was less likely to be deported. A person who did not work was disposable. Despite everything, culture flickered quietly within the walls. Education, illegal, dangerous, and precious, continued in secret. Teachers transformed basements and attics into makeshift classrooms, whispering lessons in mathematics, Hebrew, Yiddish literature, and history. Children huddled together on crates or cold floors, clutching stubby pencils and scraps of paper. Their eyes shone with a determination far older than their years. When chalk ran out, they traced lessons in dust. When books were confiscated, they memorized stories word for word. Knowledge became resistance. Every lesson whispered in the dark declared that the Nazis could imprison bodies, but not minds. Music survived too. Violins smuggled in pieces. Flutes carved from wood. Accordions passed from hand to trembling hand at night. Musicians played quietly in stairwells or abandoned courtyards, their melodies rising softly through the cold air. Songs that once echoed in Vilnius theaters now drifted through the silence like ghosts of the world before. People paused to listen, even for a moment, because music reminded them that beauty had existed, and might one day again. Even theater found a way to exist. A small performance staged in a cramped room, with actors whispering lines that carried double meanings. Lines about oppression, loss, survival, became a kind of coded rebellion. A gesture, a smile, a pause on stage conveyed truths too dangerous to speak openly. Audiences sat packed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glistening in the dim light. For an hour, they could forget the hunger, the fear, the walls. Art became oxygen. Religious life persisted in hidden pockets. Rabbis led secret prayer gatherings, their voices low but steady. In the glow of flickering candles, families celebrated the Sabbath with fragments of tradition, a crust of bread, a whispered blessing, a single candle burning where once there had been many. These rituals stitched the past to the present, giving people something to hold on to when everything else crumbled. But even in moments of peace, danger lingered. Patrols swept through the ghetto in search of illegal food, forbidden gatherings, or anyone without papers. German soldiers burst into homes unannounced, dragging people out for interrogation or beating men in front of their children. Lithuanian guards shot anyone who approached the fence too closely. Curfew violations meant death. Disease spread without mercy. Typhus, lice, influenza. Illness became another executioner. The ghetto developed its own moral code, fractured and constantly shifting. People fought to protect their families, but also shared food with neighbors who had nothing. Some stole to survive. Others risked their lives to help strangers. The lines between right and wrong blurred, then disappeared entirely. In a place where death hovered over every decision, morality became a luxury no one could afford. Even so, glimpses of humanity persisted. A child offering half a crust of bread to an elderly neighbor. A doctor tending to patients long after supplies had run out. A musician playing a lullaby outside a window where a family had lost a child. These small acts became lifelines, threads of compassion weaving through the darkness. But daily life was defined by fear. Fear of hunger. Fear of disease. Fear of the Germans. Fear of the next action, the next roundup. Everyone in the ghetto lived with the knowledge that at any moment, soldiers could sweep into the streets, order people into lines, and select hundreds for resettlement. Everyone knew what resettlement meant now. Ponary, the forest, the pits, the end. Children learned to hide the moment they heard engines. Mothers prepared hiding spots under floorboards, behind false walls, inside abandoned chimneys. Families rehearsed escape routes inside their own apartments. A single hesitation could mean death. And always, there was the haunting knowledge that any day could be the last. People stopped planning for the future. They planned only for the next sunrise, the next meal, the next moment. Survival lived in increments now. Despite everything, the people of the Vilna Ghetto clung fiercely to whatever dignity they could keep. They brushed their hair, even when water was scarce. They mended clothes until the fabric barely held together. They used humor, dry, bitter, sharp humor, to keep despair at bay. They told stories at night, stories of the Vilna that once existed, so children would know their world had not always been this way. They refused to let the Nazis define them solely as victims. They held on to identity, culture, faith, memory, because losing those would mean losing themselves entirely. But the ghetto was shrinking. The walls felt tighter each day. The population dwindled with every deportation, every death, every act of violence. And beneath the fragile rhythms of daily life, something else was growing too, a quiet, simmering determination. People began to ask new questions. Dark questions, dangerous questions, questions about resistance, about fighting back, about taking control of their fate, even if it meant dying on their own terms. Whispers traveled through the narrow streets, passing from one home to another. Ponary is death. The Germans will not let us live. We must do something. Anything. The young listened closely. The brave leaned forward. The desperate nodded. Because they all knew one truth. The ghetto was not the end. It was only the waiting room for something far worse. And as hunger deepened, as patrols grew more aggressive, as the walls seemed to move closer and closer each day, the people of Vilna could feel the next chapter taking shape in the air around them. A chapter written not in fear, but in fire. Resistance was coming. Chapter 6, Jacob Jens, Leadership Under Impossible Choices. He walked through the ghetto like a man carrying a world on his back, his posture straight, but his eyes shadowed by a weight no human being should ever have to bear. Jacob Jens, the head of the Vilna Ghetto, was both feared and respected, condemned and defended, despised and desperately needed. To some, he was a savior. To others, a traitor. To everyone, he was the man the Germans forced between his people and death. And every step he took down those narrow, suffocating streets reminded him that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried, he would never escape the knowledge that every decision he made cost someone their life. Before the war, Jens was a soldier, a man shaped by discipline and order. He had served in the Lithuanian army, rising through the ranks with quiet determination. He understood command. He understood structure. He understood that sometimes survival meant doing things others would not understand. But nothing in his past could have prepared him for the nightmare of the ghetto. When the Germans appointed him as head of the Jewish Council, they handed him power that was less a privilege than a curse. They gave him authority over a doomed population, and then they watched what he would do with it. Jens accepted the position not because he desired it, but because he believed, perhaps naively, perhaps courageously, that someone had to take responsibility. Someone had to negotiate. Someone had to bargain, beg, plead, strategize, calculate. Someone had to face the Germans and tell them no when possible, and yes when not possible. Someone had to try to save as many lives as could still be saved. Jens understood something many others did not. The Germans were going to kill. Nothing could stop that. The question was not how to prevent the murders, but how to delay them. How buy time? How to salvage fragments of a community being dismantled piece by piece. His philosophy was brutally simple. Work meant life. If Jews could be useful to the Germans, essential, even, then perhaps they might be allowed to survive longer. If the ghetto could produce value, garments, boots, tools, labor, then maybe, just maybe, the machine of death would be slowed. It was not hope. It was not idealism. It was a strategy born from cold realism. Jens believed that survival required compromise, and compromise required doing things that would stain his name forever. He organized the ghetto with military precision. Workshops multiplied. Labor brigades were assigned strict schedules. Every able-bodied person was expected to work. Even children older than 10 found themselves sewing buttons, sorting scraps, patching torn uniforms. Jens walked through the workshops inspecting every detail, the rows of sewing machines, the piles of leather, the soldiers supervising production. He needed everything to run smoothly because any inefficiency, any delay could cost lives. The Germans demanded output. If the ghetto failed to deliver, the consequences would be immediate and brutal. But for every job Jens created, there were more people than work, more mouths than rations, more pleas than answers. The population of the ghetto was shrinking with every action, every deportation, every killing in Ponary. And Jens knew the horrifying truth. The Germans no longer viewed the Jews as a people. They viewed them as numbers. Numbers that needed to be reduced. Numbers that needed to be managed. When they demanded those numbers, they came to Jens, and he had to respond. These were the moments that broke him, the moments that haunted him, the moments historians still argue about. When the Germans ordered him to produce hundreds of Jews for resettlement, Jens had to choose who lived and who died. He tried to spare families. He tried to save workers. He tried to protect anyone with a skill or a job that might be useful. But trying meant someone else had to be taken instead. And every time he signed a list, every time he spoke a name, he knew he was condemning them to Ponary. People begged him, mothers with children clinging to their skirts, old men trembling with fear, young workers down on their knees. They begged him to remove their names, to save them, to choose someone else. But Jens did not have a luxury of mercy. Mercy would have meant defiance. Defiance would have meant retaliation. And retaliation meant hundreds more dead. He believed that sacrificing a few could save the many. It was a philosophy as old as war and as cruel as the world he was trapped in. Word spread through the ghetto about these lists. Some cursed Jens, called him a collaborator, a puppet, a murderer. Others defended him, insisting that without him, the entire ghetto would have been liquidated months earlier. To them, Jens was a shield, even if a fragile one, standing between the Jewish community and the Nazi machine. But no one envied him. No one wanted his job. No one could imagine carrying the burden he carried. On the streets, Jens projected authority. He walked quickly, decisively, his coat buttoned to his collar, his hat pulled low. Guards stepped aside when he passed. Workers straightened themselves. Children watched him with wide eyes. He spoke clearly, firmly, sharply. He needed people to obey. He needed them to understand that discipline was survival. Disorder meant death. He had no room for sentiment. He had no time for hesitation. But behind closed doors, he was a different man. He confided in his closest assistants that every choice felt like a knife twisting in his chest. He knew he was hated. He knew he was viewed as a tool of the Germans. But he also knew that if he refused to act, the Germans would bring someone worse, someone eager to reduce the population, someone without a conscience, someone willing to kill openly rather than reluctantly. Jens believed he was saving lives. Others believed he was only delaying the inevitable. Both were right. Both were wrong. That was the tragic paradox of his role. The Germans used him like a scalpel. They understood exactly how to break a community, force its leaders to make impossible choices, then let the community tear itself apart from the inside. Jens was caught in this trap. He faced threats constantly. German officials made it clear that if he failed to cooperate, he would be shot, and someone else would be appointed in his place. He saw their eyes when they said it. They were not bluffing. And so, Jens negotiated relentlessly. He spent hours with German officers, tried to persuade them to spare certain workers, certain families, certain professions. He argued that the ghetto needed stability, that skilled laborers should not be deported, that killing too many people would weaken productivity. Sometimes his arguments worked. Sometimes they didn't. But he never stopped trying, because every postponement meant one more day of life for someone in the ghetto. He also clashed with the underground resistance, those who believed the only honorable response was to fight, to rebel, to choose death on their own terms rather than die quietly. The FPO, the United Partisan Organization, saw Jens as an obstacle. They accused him of cooperating with the Germans, of prioritizing work over dignity, of sacrificing lives too readily. To them, survival meant defiance. To Jens, survival meant restraint. They believed the ghetto needed to rise. He believed rising would destroy it. This divide tore the community apart. Young fighters whispered that Jens was preparing to hand over resistance members to the Germans. Older residents whispered that the fighters would provoke retaliation that would kill them all. Families were split not only by deportations, but by ideology. What did survival mean? What did dignity mean? What did resistance mean? No one could agree. And this tension simmered beneath every conversation, every secret meeting, every narrow alleyway in the ghetto. Jens felt the pressure every second of every day. He barely slept. He barely ate. His eyes grew darker. His voice grew sharper. But he continued to walk the streets, inspecting workshops, checking production reports, ensuring that every factory met its quotas. He was determined to prove to the Germans that the ghetto was indispensable, that eliminating it would hurt their war effort, that Jewish labor had value. Under his leadership, the ghetto developed a grim but functioning system. Workshops produced thousands of uniforms and boots for German soldiers. Tailors stitched through the night. Carpenters crafted toolboxes and furniture. Cobblers repaired worn boots. Every item was delivered to the Germans. And every delivery bought another day of survival. Families clung to that fragile stability, even as they resented the price. They prayed that Jin's strategy would work. They prayed he could buy enough time for the war to turn. They prayed for liberation, even though liberation felt impossibly far away. But even within the confines of this grim order, tragedies unfolded daily. Jins was forced to confront emergencies constantly. Disease outbreaks, food shortages, disputes between families packed into single rooms, thefts born from desperation, smuggling networks, German raids. He handled each crisis with tense, exhausted determination. But behind the authority, he was crumbling. Those who worked closely with him noticed the signs. A tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. The way he lingered too long over names on deportation lists. The moments when he stared into space, eyes hollow, as if listening to voices no one else could hear. The guilt was eating him alive. And yet, he forced himself onward. Because stopping meant surrender. And surrender meant doom. One night, after a long meeting with German officers who demanded another transport to Ponary, Jin sat alone in his office. He stared at the list of names in front of him. Names he had to choose. Names of people he knew. Names of neighbors. Names of workers. Names of mothers and fathers and children. He held his head in his hands and whispered to himself, "How do I decide who must die so that others may live?" But no answer came. There was no answer. Only silence. He selected names anyway. This was his burden. Despite everything, some Jews still believed Jins was doing the best possible under unimaginable circumstances. They saw him fight for exemptions, argue for better rations, protect workers, punish collaborators, and try to broker safety where none existed. They recognized the impossible bind he was in. They saw him as a tragic figure, flawed but trying, struggling, drowning, but still standing. Others refused to forgive him. They saw only the deportations, the lists, the compromises. They believed he had surrendered too easily, that he worked too closely with the Germans, that he had internalized their logic. They whispered that he cared only about control, only about power. They said he had forgotten his people, forgotten their suffering, forgotten justice. Both perspectives were incomplete. Both were true. Both were false. Because the ghetto itself was a moral paradox, and no one, not Jins, not the fighters, not the families, could escape its contradictions. As months passed, the walls around the ghetto tightened. The population shrank. The killings increased. The Germans demanded more deportations. The resistance grew bolder. And Jins found himself standing on a bridge with collapse on both sides. Every day that he managed to postpone an action was a victory. Every day without new deportations was a gift. Every day of work was another day of life for someone. But he could feel the pressure building. He knew the Germans would not tolerate the ghetto forever. He knew his strategies were temporary. He knew he was running out of time. And then came the day when the Germans told him that work was no longer enough, that the ghetto would soon be liquidated, that the end was inevitable. Jins did not tell the people. Not yet. He walked the streets in silence, carrying the knowledge like a stone in his chest. He looked at the children and wondered how many days they had left. He watched the workers and wondered who would survive the week. He saw the musicians, the teachers, the doctors, and he felt the crushing weight of all the lives slipping beyond his reach. He had always believed that he could buy time. That time could save someone. Anyone. But now the clock was ticking down faster than he could stop it. The final chapters of the ghetto were approaching, and Jacob Jins, the man who had spent every breath trying to save fragments of a shattered world, knew that soon he would face the ultimate decision. The decision he could never escape. The decision that would define him forever. And in the darkness ahead, the storm was gathering. The Germans had made their choice. Soon, they would demand the ghetto's final sacrifice. Chapter 7. Children of the Vilna Ghetto. They were the smallest bodies trapped behind the walls, but they carried the heaviest shadows. In the Vilna Ghetto, childhood did not end slowly or gently or naturally. It was ripped away in a single moment, the moment the gates closed and the world outside turned to smoke. Children who once ran freely across the courtyards of the Jerusalem of Lithuania now lived in a place where laughter was dangerous, where games were played in whispers, and where every sunrise tightened the invisible noose around their necks. The ghetto did not allow children to grow up. It forced them to become survivors before they were old enough to understand what the word meant. On the morning the ghetto was sealed, the cries of children filled the air like a choir of broken bells. Mothers carried toddlers pressed tightly against their chests, their small faces buried in shawls to block out the terror unfolding around them. Older children clung to their parents' hands, trying to stay brave, but trembling at the sight of soldiers and snarling dogs. Some were too young to understand why they were being pushed into unfamiliar streets. Others understood all too well, their eyes already reflecting a knowledge no child should ever have. Inside the ghetto, every step was a lesson in fear. Children learned quickly, faster than adults, the silent rules of survival. They learned that voices must be quiet, that running must be hidden, that hunger was normal, that tears had to be swallowed. They learned that if a German appeared at the end of the street, you did not look at him. You lowered your head. You made yourself small, invisible, forgettable. Children became shadows. Food, the dictator of life in the ghetto, shaped the fate of every child. Hunger hollowed their cheeks, thinned their limbs, slowed their steps. Babies were born already starving. Tiny, fragile beings who cried faintly because they did not have the strength to cry louder. Mothers tried to breastfeed, even when their bodies had no milk left to give. Toddlers gnawed on crusts of stale bread, soaking them in water until they softened. Some children scavenged in trash heaps, picking through scraps for anything edible. Others stood for hours in soup lines, clutching dented tin cups, hoping the ladle would reach them before the pot emptied. But even hunger could not extinguish the instinct to play. Children found ways to carve tiny spaces of hope inside the darkness. They played with buttons instead of marbles, scraps of cloth instead of dolls, chalk drawings instead of toys. They chased each other through narrow alleys until a guard shouted, and they scattered like startled birds. They giggled for a moment, and then the laughter faded into silence, as if the walls themselves demanded it. Education, forbidden by German law, became one of the boldest acts of defiance inside the ghetto. Teachers transformed hidden rooms, basements, and attics into makeshift classrooms. Children gathered quietly, sitting on floorboards or crates, listening with wide, hungry eyes as teachers whispered lessons. They learned arithmetic, sentences in Yiddish and Hebrew, bits of geography, fragments of history. Every lesson was a weapon, proof that even in a place designed to destroy them, Jewish children could still learn, still imagine a future, still carry the torch of knowledge passed down through generations. Parents risked everything to keep their children learning. A book hidden under a mattress could mean death. A notebook smuggled under a coat could lead to arrest. But mothers insisted. Fathers insisted. If they destroy our books, they will not destroy our minds. Children repeated those words, burying them deep inside. They understood that education was not just learning. It was resistance. But not all lessons came from books. Many came from the streets. Harsh, bitter lessons that carved themselves into the children's bones. They learned to identify the sound of approaching soldiers. They learned where to hide during surprise raids. They learned which neighbors could be trusted and which ones whispered too loudly. They learned to watch the adults' faces for clues, reading fear like a second language. Childhood became a daily study in danger. Some children, especially the older ones, became smugglers. It was one of the most dangerous roles in the ghetto, and also one of the most vital. They crawled under fences, squeezed through cracks in the walls, slithered through sewers, and climbed half-collapsed rooftops to reach the outside. Their small bodies could pass where adults could not. They brought back bread, potatoes, flour, anything they could hide under their shirts or in their shoes. Many were caught. Some were beaten. Some were shot on sight. But others returned night after night, driven by the knowledge that their families depended on them. These children carried the weight of entire households on their narrow shoulders. The ghetto's orphanage became a place of both refuge and heartbreak. It housed children who had seen too much, children whose parents had vanished during roundups, or been taken to Ponary, or died of starvation or disease. The orphanage workers did everything they could to offer comfort, routine, and care. They organized games. They taught songs. They tried to create a sense of family. But children are not easily fooled. They knew why they were there. They felt the absence of their parents like a wound, and the orphanage itself was not safe. German patrols sometimes stormed it without warning, searching for anyone they deemed unproductive. The worst act of cruelty came during the Kinder Action, the children's roundup. It began without warning, like a storm ripping through the streets. German and Lithuanian soldiers surrounded the ghetto, sealing every exit. Mothers clutched their children, pressing them against their bodies, hiding them in cupboards, under beds, in crawl spaces dug beneath floors. Babies were sedated with drops of vodka to keep them from crying. Older children were told to lie still, not to breathe loudly, not to move no matter what they heard. Then the soldiers burst in. They tore through streets and homes, dragging children from hiding places, prying infants from their mothers' arms, beating anyone who resisted. The screams that filled the ghetto that day did not sound human. They were animal screams, primal, torn from the souls of parents losing pieces of their hearts. Mothers fought like lions, scratching, biting, clinging desperately to their children as soldiers struck them with rifle butts. Fathers threw themselves into the chaos, begging, bargaining, pleading. But the soldiers were unmoved. They pulled children away by their legs, by their hair, by whatever they could grab. The ground was littered with toys and pacifiers. Mothers collapsed in doorways after their children were taken, their bodies shaking so violently they could barely breathe. The soldiers gathered hundreds of children in the streets, some crying, some eerily silent, some too young to understand what was happening. They loaded them into trucks, or marched them out of the ghetto in long lines. Some children asked where they were going. No one answered. Some asked if they would see their mothers again. The silence that followed was heavier than any words. Not one of the children taken in the Kinder Action survived. They were taken to Ponary. They were shot, buried in pits too deep for any light to reach. The ghetto never recovered from that day. A silence settled over it. A silence so heavy it seemed to crush the very air. Mothers walked like ghosts. Fathers stared blankly at walls. The laughter that had once flickered in alleys went out like a candle in the wind. Even the youngest children sensed the shift. Something enormous, something precious, had been ripped from the heart of the ghetto. And yet, incredibly, the children who remained continued to fight for life. Some continued to smuggle food. Others continued to attend secret lessons. They played games in the shadows. They whispered stories before bed. They leaned on each other. They refused to let the darkness swallow them whole. Doctors and caregivers inside the ghetto did everything they could to save the children who were left. They created makeshift clinics, treating illnesses with improvised remedies, onion poultices, herbal teas, warm rags. They nursed infants whose mothers could no longer produce milk, feeding them mixtures of water and flour just to keep them alive another day. Every saved child felt like a victory against the Germans' relentless hatred. But even in moments of compassion, the danger never retreated. Typhus swept through the ghetto, killing children indiscriminately. Harsh winters froze their fingers and toes. Weak hearts gave out under the strain of starvation. Parents dug small graves in bitter, frozen earth, their hands numb, their breath visible in the cold air. For the Jewish children of Vilna, the ghetto was not just a prison. It was a battlefield. Every day demanded courage. Every night demanded endurance. Their innocence did not protect them. If anything, it made them more vulnerable, more targeted, more fragile. And yet they clung to life with a strength that astonished even the adults around them. In the final months of the ghetto, as the resistance movement gained strength and the Germans tightened their grip, the children felt the tension rise like a storm about to break. Some of the older boys dreamed of joining the partisans, of slipping through the sewers and escaping into the forest to fight. They whisper about guns, about revenge, about liberation. Some managed to escape. Others were caught. Others simply disappeared, their fates unknown. When the liquidation of the ghetto began in September 1943, children once again became targets. Families hid their youngest in attics, basements, chimneys. Some parents chose to give their children to sympathetic Poles or Lithuanians outside the ghetto, knowing it might be the only chance for survival. The act felt like tearing away a piece of their own soul, but they did it anyway. Love demanded impossible sacrifices. As the final selections were made, soldiers ripped children from their parents once more. Some were sent to labor camps. Most were sent to Ponary. The ghetto that had once echoed with the footsteps of thousands of children now grew quiet. Too quiet. When the last survivors walked out of the ruins of the Vilna Ghetto after liberation, they carried memories too heavy for any human to hold. They remembered faces, so many faces. They remembered the laughter that dimmed too quickly, the small hands that slipped out of theirs, the games played with broken toys in broken streets, the whispered lessons in underground classrooms, the songs sung at night to hide the sound of fear. The children of Vilna did not leave behind diaries as famous as in Frank's. They did not leave behind photographs in large numbers. Many did not leave behind names. But their stories remain carved into the bones of history, a testimony to innocence shattered and courage sharpened by terror. And as the survivors stepped out into a world forever changed, they knew that the next chapter, the one rising like a spark in the ashes, would not be written by children at all. It would be written by those who had watched the children die, and those who swore, with all the fire left in their hearts, that the world would never again be allowed to forget them. Chapter 8. The Rise of the FPO, Fighting Organization of the Ghetto. It began with a whisper, not a loud cry, not a rallying slogan, not a call to arms shouted from rooftops, but a whisper passed from one terrified room to another, from one starving family to the next, from the lips of those who still believe that even in this place of death, resistance was not just possible, it was necessary. The whisper carried a truth that could no longer be denied. Ponary was not a labor site. Ponary was not a transit stop. Ponary was not a temporary punishment. Ponary was death. Once that truth settled over the Vilna Ghetto like smoke, something stirred in the shadows, something that had been forming quietly, waiting for the moment when hope and despair would collide. That something was the FPO, the Fahrenheit Partisan Organizatie, the United Partisan Organization. And their motto, whispered like a vow in the dark, would change everything. We will not go like sheep to the slaughter. The idea was not born in a single room or from a single mind. It was born from grief, from rage, from the unbearable knowledge of what awaited them beyond the forest line. It was born in young men who lost their families, in women who had nothing left to lose, in students who refused to let their minds be chained, in ordinary workers who had seen enough death to know that submission meant extinction. They did not form a resistance because they believed they would win. They formed it because to do nothing would have meant surrendering the last fragments of dignity they still possessed. The earliest meetings happened in secrecy so deep that participants risked immediate execution just by attending. They met in abandoned workshops, in the basements beneath half-collapsed buildings, in attics where frost gathered in the corners, and every breath showed in the air. Candles were shielded behind crates and blankets, so no light spilled into the street. The participants spoke softly, leaning forward, their faces tense, their hearts pounding. Every knock on the wall, every footstep outside, could have been a soldier. But the greater fear, the fear of doing nothing, kept them together. At the center of these early gatherings stood three figures whose names would become symbols of the ghetto's defiance: Yitzhak Wittenberg, Joseph Glasman, and Abba Kovner. They were young, they were determined, and they carried a kind of fire that starvation, brutality, and terror could not extinguish. Wittenberg was a communist, a man shaped by ideological discipline and a deep belief in organized struggle. Glasman was a leader of the Zionist youth movements, charismatic, fiercely loyal, and unafraid to confront authority. Kovner was a poet, thin, intense, with eyes that seemed to see beyond the walls, beyond the ghetto, into the dark future that awaited if they remained still. It was Kovner who gave voice to the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. In a famous speech delivered on the eve of 1942, he declared, "Let us not be led like sheep to the slaughter. Ponary is not a labor camp. All are taken to Ponary to be killed." Those words spread through the ghetto like a shockwave. People whispered them at night, afraid to believe them, but unable to forget them. Mothers held their children closer. Fathers stared at the floor. The world seemed to tilt. And once the truth was spoken aloud, denial became impossible. The ghetto had been living in the shadow of Ponary for months, but now that shadow had a name, and it demanded a response. The FPO began collecting weapons, if one could even call them that. A few pistols smuggled in by bribe guards. A couple of rifles stolen from Lithuanian collaborators. Homemade grenades crafted from tin cans and scraps of metal. Knives, axes, iron rods. They hid these weapons under floorboards, inside walls, beneath piles of rags. Every bullet was counted, polished, and treated like treasure. They trained quietly at night, learning how to fire, how to dismantle a gun, how to move silently through the alleys. Their arsenal was pitiful compared to the German war machine, but to them, it was everything. It was proof that they were not powerless. But resistance was not just about weapons. It was about information. The FPO built a network of informants, couriers who memorized messages and delivered them verbally so nothing written could be found. They smuggled news from outside the ghetto, information about other uprisings, about partisan groups in the forests, about German movements and weaknesses. They forged connections with Polish resistance fighters, trading intelligence, sharing weapons, and planning coordinated actions. Every scrap of information was a lifeline. The ghetto's population, however, was divided. Not everyone believed in resistance. Not everyone believed fighting back was wise. Many feared that an uprising would bring catastrophic retaliation, that the Germans would slaughter every man, woman, and child in response. Others simply wanted to survive a little longer, to cling to the fragile stability that Jacob Jens had carved out through his negotiations. For them, the FPO represented danger, unpredictability, a spark that could ignite total destruction. This tension between survival and resistance became the defining struggle of the Vilna Ghetto. And Jens, standing between the Germans and the Jews, found himself forced in a conflict with the very people who saw resistance as the only path left. The FPO and Jens viewed the same landscape, but from opposite ends. To the fighters, every moment spent waiting was a moment closer to annihilation. To Jens, every moment spent resisting brought annihilation closer. They were bound together by fear, but separated by strategy. Despite these tensions, the FPO continued to grow. Young men and women, especially those who had lost their families, joined with fierce determination. They understood that the Germans were tightening their grip, that the ghetto would not survive forever, that to wait was to die. They trained in small groups, sharing their few weapons, memorizing escape routes, learning how to climb walls, how to slip through sewers, how to vanish into the crowd. The sound of their whispered drills echoed faintly beneath the ordinary noise of the ghetto. Hunger, work, grief, but it was there, a second heartbeat beneath the surface. One of the greatest challenges the FPO faced was morale. How do you convince people who are starving, terrified, and broken that resistance is worth the risk? The fighters held meetings with community members, speaking passionately about the need to strike back. They handed out leaflets printed on stolen paper with slogans calling for unity and courage. They met with workers in workshops, urging them to join or at least support the movement. Some listened. Some refused. Many stayed silent. Still, the FPO persisted. They carried themselves with a quiet pride. They moved through the ghetto with a sense of purpose, even when they walked carefully to avoid drawing attention. They formed bonds with each other, brotherhoods and sisterhoods forged not in freedom, but in desperation and hope. One of their most dangerous tasks involved smuggling weapons from outside the ghetto. They bribed guards with jewelry or food. They crawled through tunnels dug under the walls. They disguised themselves as laborers and slipped weapons hidden in baskets or toolboxes. Every successful smuggling operation felt like a victory over the Germans. Every pistol brought inside the ghetto felt like a step toward reclaiming their humanity. The FPO also conducted acts of sabotage. They derailed trains carrying supplies to German troops. They set fires in storage depots. They destroyed documents. They stole weapons from German patrols when the opportunity presented itself. These acts were small in scale, but they carried enormous symbolic power. They were proof that the Jews of Vilna were not simply victims. They were fighters. They were alive. But the resistance came at a cost. The Germans were not blind. They sensed the growing unrest. They increased raids. They arrested suspected members. Torture became common. Interrogations brutal. The mere suspicion of belonging to the FPO could lead to execution. The fighters lived with constant fear, not of dying, but of being captured and forced to betray their comrades. The FPO operated like a living organism, constantly adapting, constantly shifting. When one safe house was compromised, they moved to another. When a courier disappeared, they changed their communication routes. When the Germans increased patrols, the fighters melted into the shadows. They became ghosts, slipping between the cracks of the ghetto's crumbling world. And yet, for all their preparation and courage, the FPO faced an impossible barrier. The majority of the ghetto's population did not support an uprising. They were too afraid, too hungry, too desperate to protect their children. When the fighters spoke of rebellion, mothers shook their heads. Fathers clenched their fists. Older residents looked away, their eyes filled with sorrow and fear. They wanted to live, even if living meant enduring the unbearable. The biggest test of the FPO's strength came during the Wittenberg affair, when the Germans demanded that Yitzhak Wittenberg, one of the resistance leaders, be handed over. It was the moment when the ghetto had to choose between fighting and surviving. And when the choice came, the majority demanded Wittenberg surrender. They were terrified that refusing would bring destruction upon the entire ghetto. The FPO resisted at first. They had Wittenberg. They prepared for battle. They drew weapons, ready for the signal to rise. But the people, those same people the FPO had hoped to inspire, crowded the streets, shouting that they did not want to die. They blocked the fighters' movement. They begged, screamed, argued, pleaded. They said the resistance was going to doom them all. Faced with the voices of thousands, Wittenberg made a decision that would become legend. He surrendered himself. He walked out into the night, escorted by members of the FPO who wept as they accompanied him. What happened to him in custody remains uncertain. Poisoned by the Germans, murdered outright, or killed by collaborators. But the effect of his death was immediate. It traumatized the resistance. It broke morale. It deepened the divide between fighters and civilians. But it did not destroy the FPO. Instead, it hardened them. They swore that the next time the Germans came for them, they would not hand over another leader. They would not negotiate. They would fight. The months that followed were filled with tension. The Germans increased their surveillance. Raids intensified. Deportations resumed. And the FPO knew the final confrontation was approaching. They trained harder, prepared escape routes into the forests, strengthened their ties with partisan units outside Vilna. They waited for the moment when the Germans would move to liquidate the ghetto, and promised that when that day came, they would not go quietly. By the summer of 1943, the writing was on the wall. The Germans had begun liquidating ghettos across Eastern Europe. Vilna's turn was coming. The fighters felt the air change. They felt the dread in every corner. They felt the walls closing in. And as the final days approached, the FPO gathered one last time under the flickering glow of candles, surrounded by the weapons they had risked everything to collect. They looked into each other's eyes and knew what they were choosing. Not survival, not safety, not surrender. They were choosing defiance, even if it meant death. They whispered their motto one last time, letting it settle over them like armor. We will not go like sheep to the slaughter. And in the silence that followed, the future tightened its grip on the Vilna Ghetto, preparing to unleash a storm that no one could outrun. The fight was coming. The walls were closing, and the last breath of the ghetto was about to ignite into flame. Chapter 9: Wittenberg Affair, Betrayal, Chaos, and Defiance. It began with footsteps in the dark, heavy, deliberate, echoing across the narrow stone corridors of the ghetto like the beat of a war drum. People heard them before they saw anything, a sound that made the hairs on their arms rise and their hearts thump against their ribs. Something was wrong. Something was shifting in the air. The Germans had not entered. Not yet. But the tension felt like a storm gathering above the rooftops, pulling every breath into its center. And then the whisper spread. They have come for Wittenberg. 3 words that would rip the Vilna Ghetto in two, shatter trust, test loyalties, and expose a wound so deep that its scar would never fully heal. Yitzhak Wittenberg had always known he was a marked man. As one of the main leaders of the FPO, the underground resistance, his name was whispered in meetings, written in coded messages, and held close like a secret ember that could ignite rebellion at any moment. He was a symbol, a strategist, a believer in resistance, and the Germans feared him, not because of the weapons he controlled, those were few, not because of the number of fighters at his side, those were fewer. They feared him because he understood the truth of their intentions. He knew that Ponary was not a threat, but a plan, that the ghetto was not a prison, but a waiting room for execution. And he dared to say it aloud. That truth made him dangerous. And now the Germans wanted him. They demanded he be handed over. They claimed he was a communist, a Soviet agent. Charges that, in this new world of brutality and lies, meant nothing except one outcome: death. The Ghetto Council, led by Jacob Jens, received the order with dread. The Germans wanted Wittenberg alive, but not for long. They wanted him tortured, questioned, and then erased. If Jens refused, the Germans promised they would retaliate. Hundreds would die, maybe thousands. And so, Jens did something that would haunt him until the end. He agreed. He agreed to hand over Wittenberg to save the ghetto from immediate destruction. But he knew the FPO would never surrender one of their leaders willingly. He knew the fighters would resist. He knew the ghetto could erupt in a civil war. And yet he still agreed. Because in his mind, the logic was brutal but clear. One life for many. One death to save a community. It was an impossible calculation, made in a world where every choice carried an unbearable price. The arrest began at night. Lithuanian police moved swiftly, coordinated by German orders. They found Wittenberg in a safe house, his back pressed against a cold wall as the door burst open. The police flooded in, their boots pounding against the floorboards. FPO members nearby scrambled for weapons, hands shaking as they aimed pistols at the intruders. Then, over the chaos, came the shout that stopped everything. Stand down. It was Jens. He stepped into the room, his face carved with exhaustion, his voice steady but hollow. He told Wittenberg that resistance now would only bring slaughter, that the Germans were outside waiting, that the ghetto could not afford a battle. He ordered the fighters to lower their guns. Some refused, pointing their weapons at Jens instead. For a moment, the room crackled with the possibility that Jews might fire on Jews. But Wittenberg raised his hand. He did not want bloodshed among his own people. He allowed himself to be taken. The police dragged him into the street, his wrists bound, the cold air stinging his skin. Word spread like wildfire through the ghetto. People rushed to windows, stairwells, balconies. They watched in disbelief as the man many saw as a warrior was marched through the streets like a criminal. Whispers turned to gasps. Gasps turned to shouts. And then the shouting grew into a roar. Free Wittenberg! Free Wittenberg! The FPO heard the cries and sprang into action. Fighters armed with pistols, knives, and Molotov cocktails moved toward the patrol. They surrounded the Lithuanian police, faces masked with determination, fingers tight around the triggers. The police hesitated. The air thickened. A single misstep could ignite a massacre. Then, something extraordinary happened. The crowd intervened. Not to support the FPO, but to push them back. Ordinary Jews, fathers, mothers, workers, surrounded the fighters, shouting at them to stop. They shoved them aside, forming a human barrier around the police. They were terrified. They were desperate. They did not want an uprising. Not now, not like this. They believed the Germans' threat. They believed that resisting would doom them all. Caught between the police and the people they had sworn to protect, the FPO hesitated. Their unity trembled. Their purpose blurred. And in that brief moment of confusion, the patrol retreated with Wittenberg. They vanished into the night, taking with them not just a man, but the fragile balance holding the ghetto together. The next morning, the ghetto was on the verge of tearing itself apart. People gathered in groups, arguing, shouting, crying. Some called Jens a traitor. Others praised him for preventing bloodshed. Parents feared for their children. Workers feared losing their jobs. The elderly feared another action. The tension was unbearable. The FPO was caught in the middle, betrayed by the council, rejected by the people, hunted by the Germans. They retreated into hiding, furious and humiliated. Their dream of uniting the ghetto behind them had shattered. They blamed Jens. They blamed the population. They blamed themselves. And yet, they still held on to one belief. Wittenberg must be saved. But Wittenberg had other plans. While imprisoned in a building controlled by the ghetto police, he managed to escape with help from loyal fighters. He returned to the ghetto, slipping into an attic hideout. The FPO rejoiced. They believed this was the moment to rise, to rally the people, overthrow the council, and prepare for a coordinated uprising. They sent messengers to gather weapons. Fighters sharpened blades, loaded guns, filled bottles with gasoline. But when they went into the streets, the people met them with fury. It was a revolt, not against the Germans, but against the FPO. Hundreds of residents blocked the alleys. They shouted that resistance would lead to their extermination. They claimed the fighters were endangering their children. Some threw stones. Others spat. Many cried openly, begging the FPO to surrender Wittenberg, begging them not to condemn the entire community. It was a devastating blow. The FPO had believed the people would eventually stand with them. Now they saw that the ghetto was not united. It was fractured, split between survival and resistance. And in that fracture, Wittenberg stood at the center. As the crowd grew louder, the walls seemed to close in around the hiding fighters. They felt the weight of the community pressing down on them. The fear, the desperation, the frantic pleas. They realized something terrible. If they launched an uprising now, the people themselves might fight against them. Wittenberg understood this better than anyone. He saw the fear in their faces. He saw the panic in their eyes. He knew that if he refused to surrender, the ghetto could become a battlefield with Jews killing Jews. And he refused to let that happen. So he made his decision. He stepped forward from the shadows, his face pale, his voice soft but steady, and told his comrades that he would go. The fighters protested. They begged him to flee. They urged him to escape to the forests, to join the partisans, to survive. But he shook his head. He said the words they would never forget. I will not be the cause of Jewish bloodshed. He walked out of the hideout and into the waiting arms of the ghetto police. The FPO watched him go, their hearts heavy with grief and rage. The crowd fell silent as he passed, and for a brief moment, shame flickered in their eyes. They had demanded his surrender, but seeing it broke something inside them. What happened next remains shrouded in uncertainty. Some say Wittenberg was poisoned in his cell by order of the Germans. Others say he took his own life to avoid torture. Others still whisper that he was beaten to death by guards who despised the resistance he represented. His body was never returned. His grave never marked. His final moments never witnessed. But his death was not quiet. It echoed through the ghetto like a scream. The FPO mourned him as a martyr, proof that resistance demanded sacrifice. The population mourned him as a tragic figure, caught in the impossible crossfire of survival and rebellion. Jens mourned him privately, seeing in his death the cost of leadership in a world with no right answers. The aftermath of the Wittenberg affair left the ghetto shattered. Trust between the council and the fighters collapsed entirely. The FPO retreated deeper underground. Their resolve hardened into something forged from loss. The population felt the weight of what they had done, whether justified or not. They had handed over one of their own. And the Germans watched with satisfaction. They had not needed to fire a single shot. They had forced the Jews to turn against each other. In the days that followed, the ghetto felt different, quieter, heavier. People avoided each other's eyes in the streets. Conversations stopped when officials walked by. Children sensed the tension and spoke in hushed tones. It was as if a shadow had fallen across the entire district, dimming whatever flicker of hope had once remained. The FPO knew now that when the final confrontation came, they would stand alone. The people would not rise with them. The council would not support them. They would fight without the backing of the community they were trying to protect. And yet, they did not back down. They gathered their remaining weapons. They trained in secrecy. They whispered Wittenberg's name like a vow. They promised that when the Germans came to liquidate the ghetto, as they knew they inevitably would, they would not run. They would not hide. They would not walk quietly into the forest. Wittenberg's death became the catalyst for a new kind of resolve. A resolve born from loss, betrayal, and clarity. The ghetto was doomed, but the fighters were determined that their final breath would not be taken at the edge of a pit. The storm was gathering, the noose tightening, and as the ghetto marched toward its final days, the memory of Wittenberg burned like a spark in the darkness, a spark that would ignite the last great act of defiance in the heart of Vilna. The next chapter would not be about leadership or survival. It would be about choosing how to die. Chapter 10, Cultural Resistance, the hidden archive of the ghetto. Long before the first shot was fired in Ponary, long before the ghetto walls rose and the soldiers sealed the gates, the Jews of Vilna had already built something powerful, something that did not kneel to bullets or starvation or fear. They had built a world of words, ideas, stories, songs, and memory. A world that refused to die. And in the darkest days of the ghetto, when death lurked behind every corner and hope slipped away like smoke between fingers, that world rose again. Not in open defiance, not in armed rebellion, but in the quiet turning of a page, the scratch of a pencil on stolen paper, the hushed breath of a poem whispered in the dark. This was cultural resistance. The fight to save not bodies, but souls. The fight to save what it meant to be human. It began with a simple question, one that spread through the ghetto like an urgent heartbeat. If we die and nothing of us survives, who will remember that we lived? That question became the spark behind the work of the Paper Brigade, the scholars, artists, librarians, writers, and ordinary people who risked their lives to preserve the cultural treasures of Vilna. They knew the Germans wanted to erase Jewish memory as much as Jewish lives. They knew the Nazis were burning books, looting libraries, destroying manuscripts. They knew that if they did nothing, the world that had once been the Jerusalem of Lithuania would vanish forever. So they acted, not with guns or bombs, but with ink, paper, hidden manuscripts, smuggled pages. The Strashen Library, once the beating heart of Jewish scholarship in Vilna, had been gutted by German orders. Priceless volumes were thrown into piles, documents torn, rare manuscripts stolen and boxed for shipment to Germany. German officials from the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, tasked with looting Jewish culture, forced Jewish scholars to sort the materials. These scholars were told to choose what was culturally valuable for Nazi archives and what could be burned or pulped. It was a cruel task, designed to break their spirits, to make them complicit in the destruction of their own heritage. But the scholars refused to obey. Quietly, secretly, they formed a resistance group within the archives itself. They began hiding books under their clothing, stuffing manuscripts into sacks meant for trash, slipping pages between boards and the floors, inside walls, beneath piles of rags. They called themselves nothing. History would call them the Paper Brigade. Figures like Abraham Sutskever, Shmur Kaczerginski, and others risked torture and death with every sheet of paper they smuggled. They worked with a calmness that belied the danger, their fingers shaking only when they were alone, away from the watchful eyes of the Germans. Each book saved felt like saving a life. Each manuscript preserved felt like an act of rebellion. They knew the Germans wanted the Jewish story to end, and that made every page they rescued a shout in the face of annihilation. But cultural resistance in the ghetto was not limited to the scholars. It lived in every corner, quietly, fiercely. Teachers who had once lectured in Vilna's universities now held secret classes in cramped basements, whispering lessons in mathematics, literature, Hebrew, and history. Children sat on the cold floor, their legs tucked beneath them, their eyes shining with hunger, not for food, but for knowledge. They memorized poems because paper was scarce. They repeated stories until they could recite them perfectly. Every whispered lesson was a strike against the Germans' plan to reduce them to nothing. Writers continued to write, even when pencils were dull, even when paper was torn, even when the risk of being caught was death. They wrote diaries, poems, plays, essays, and songs. They wrote not because they believed they would live to see their words printed, but because writing made them human. Writing reminded them that they still had voices, even when the world tried to silence them. Some buried their writings under floorboards. Others hid pages inside jars. A few handed their work to trusted friends, whispering instructions. If I don't make it, save this. Someone must save this. And then there were the artists, the painters and sketchers who saw the ghetto not only with their eyes, but with their souls. They drew everything they saw, the faces of starving children, the shadows of German patrols, the cramped rooms where families huddled together, the makeshift workshops humming with forced labor. They sketched moments of strength too, a mother braiding her daughter's hair, a couple sharing a quiet glance, a group of children playing with a button as if it were a marble. These drawings were windows into a world that the Nazis wanted erased. They were proof that beauty, even fragile beauty, survived. Musicians also refused to let the silence of death claim the ghetto. Violins, flutes, and accordions, rescued or reconstructed, became instruments of resistance. In dark rooms lit by a single candle, musicians played soft melodies that drifted through broken windows and faded into the cold night. Those who listened felt, for a moment, that they were not prisoners. Music was not just sound, it was memory. It was the echo of old Vilna, of theaters and cafes and concerts long gone. It was a reminder that even now, there was something within them that the Germans could not touch. The ghetto's theater became legendary. Actors performed quietly, their voices soft, their faces illuminated by dim lanterns. They performed comedies to make people laugh and tragedies to make them feel. They performed forbidden plays, weaving messages of unity and courage into their roles. Every performance was illegal. Every curtain rise was defiance. People packed into the small room until they were shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same thin air, their hearts beating as one. For an hour, they forgot the hunger, the fear, the humiliation. They remembered they were living. Cultural resistance did not erase the terror of daily life, but it gave people something else to cling to, something powerful, something dangerous, something the Germans could not understand. It gave them identity. It gave them voice. It gave them hope shaped into stories, poems, songs, drawings, and memories. But cultural resistance had another purpose too: documentation. The Germans wanted to control the narrative. They wanted the Jews to disappear without leaving behind witnesses. They wanted the future to forget. But the Jews of the ghetto refused to let that happen. They began documenting everything: names, dates, events, deportations, disappearances. They created hidden archives filled with testimonies, letters, reports, photographs. These archives were buried under floors, hidden in cemeteries, smuggled to the outside world. They knew that if they survived, or even if they didn't, the truth must survive. Men like Herman Kruk kept detailed diaries, chronicling the daily life of the ghetto. He recorded every law, every rumor, every action of the Judenrat, every speech by Jens, every destructive demand by the Germans. He wrote about starvation, executions, roundups, as well as the moments of humor, tenderness, and creativity that flickered in the darkness. His diary became one of the most important documents of the Holocaust, because he understood that witnessing was a form of fighting. But recording the truth carried mortal danger. The Germans were paranoid about information. Anyone caught documenting their crimes was shot immediately. Archives had to be hidden quickly, cleverly. Pages were rolled into scrolls. Bottles were filled with scraps of paper. Letters were sewn into clothing. Every hidden document was a time bomb, waiting for the future to detonate it. Yet the most extraordinary act of cultural resistance came from the paper brigade itself. Forced to select which books and documents were worthy of German collection and which were destined for destruction, they made choices that saved entire chapters of Jewish history. They risked beatings, torture, and execution to smuggle manuscripts into ghetto apartments. They created hiding places, under beds, inside wardrobes, behind false walls. They carried books under their shirts, even in the dead of winter, when the bulges beneath their coats risked exposure. Some members smuggled entire volumes out of the ghetto under piles of garbage, knowing that garbage was rarely inspected closely by German guards. Others convinced non-Jewish friends in the city to hide books in their homes. Some buried manuscripts in courtyards, hoping they would be retrieved after the war. They were not just saving paper. They were saving the intellectual heart of a people. Cultural resistance also created unity, fragile, fleeting, but desperately needed. Poetry readings took place at night, with listeners leaning close, sharing warmth, breath, sorrow, and strength. People repeated lines they loved, passing them from ear to ear like smuggled treasures. Songs were adapted with new lyrics to reflect the ghetto's reality. Children memorized stories that taught them courage. Parents whispered old legends to help them sleep, even as gunshots echoed through the streets. And through this cultural life, something remarkable happened. The ghetto refused to die spiritually. Though bodies weakened, though hunger hollowed cheeks, though disease thinned the strongest limbs, the spirit endured. Cultural resistance gave people the strength to face each day. It reminded them that the Germans could starve them, beat them, imprison them, but they could not erase them. But cultural resistance also changed the nature of political resistance. The FPO drew strength from it. They saw that the ghetto was not only a place of suffering, it was a place of meaning. It held a legacy worth fighting for. When they trained for battle, they carried poems in their pockets. When they smuggled weapons, they smuggled song lyrics too. When they prepared for a final stand, they remembered the stories of Jewish rebels who had risen before them. The Paper Brigade worked with the FPO as well, sharing information, delivering messages, observing German movements. They became the bridge between cultural survival and armed resistance, a reminder that fighting with guns and fighting with words were two sides of the same struggle. By 1943, as the threat of liquidation loomed, cultural resistance intensified. People wrote feverishly. Artists painted rapidly. Teachers gathered their students as often as possible. Musicians played as if each performance might be their last. And through it all, the Paper Brigade continued to smuggle books, refusing to let the Germans consume the heart of what had once been Vilna. When the liquidation finally came, when the ghetto began to collapse under the boots of German soldiers, when the FPO made their last desperate choices, cultural resistance endured. Some manuscripts were carried into the forest by partisans. Others were buried in hiding places so clever that they would not be discovered for decades. Diaries were hidden in chimneys, behind bricks, beneath floorboards. Some pages survived, some did not, but enough did to tell the story the Nazis wanted to erase. And that is the legacy of cultural resistance in the Vilna Ghetto. Not victory in the military sense, not survival in the physical sense, but survival in the memory of humanity. They fought to save words. They fought to save identity. They fought to save the truth. And because they fought, their world, though shattered, did not vanish. It lived on in pages that outlasted their lives, in poems that survived the ruins, in drawings rescued from rubble, in diaries that spoke for the dead. Long after the walls of the ghetto fell, long after the last survivor walked out of Vilna, the voices preserved through cultural resistance still speak, whispering the same message the fighters once swore in the shadows. We were here. We lived. We mattered. And in the next chapter, the ghetto's fragile heartbeat, kept alive by its culture, will be tested by a storm too great for any page to stop. Chapter 11. Deportations to Ponary in Estonia, 1941 to 1943. The streets of Vilna were never the same again. What had once been narrow lanes filled with children laughing and vendors shouting now became channels of dread, as if the city itself had learned the meaning of fear. Families whispered from behind shuttered windows, clutching the pieces of their lives that still remained, listening to the distant rumble of trucks, the barked orders of German soldiers, the hurried steps of Lithuanian auxiliaries. And each day, the rumble grew louder, the steps closer, the fear sharper. By the summer of 1941, it had become clear to everyone in the ghetto that the threat was not random. It was systematic, inevitable, and merciless. Every roundup, every line, every forced march carried the same hidden message. Your life is only as valuable as what the Germans decide it is. The first deportations began quietly, almost imperceptibly, under the guise of work assignments. German officers, accompanied by Lithuanian police, would enter the ghetto in the early morning, their boots echoing like a metronome of doom on the cobblestones. Lists were read aloud, names carefully selected by the Judenrat under duress, their pen strokes guided by the impossible logic of survival. Those summoned would gather quickly, dragging their meager belongings, clutching blankets, shoes, scraps of food. Mothers held their children tightly, whispering prayers, silently begging for some miracle to appear. Fathers tried to stand tall, but the knowledge in their eyes betrayed their terror. Some children didn't understand, but the air around them smelled of death so strongly they could feel it in their chests. The first major deportations were directed to Ponary. The forest beyond Vilna had already earned a grim reputation, but in the ghetto, rumors could not yet fully capture the horror. People did not know what awaited them, only that once the gates closed behind the deportees, they would vanish into the unknown. Some still believed they were being taken to labor camps, convinced that working would buy them time. That hope was cruelly short-lived. The journeys to Ponary were orchestrated with horrifying efficiency. German trucks lined up along the streets, engines growling, the air thick with smoke. Lithuanian guards, many local men who had volunteered or been coerced into service, prodded the Jewish families forward, their rifles raised, their boots stomping rhythmically on the dusty roads. Those on foot were forced to march for miles, children clinging to parents' hands, the elderly collapsing under their own weight or that of their families. Every step toward the forest was a step toward the unthinkable. Women wept openly. Men prayed silently. Some children, too small to comprehend, pressed their faces to their mothers' chests, sensing only the urgency in their heartbeat. When they arrived at Ponary, the full scale of the terror became apparent. The forest, once serene, now loomed as a cathedral of death. Trenches and pits yawned like open graves. The air carried a stench that would not dissipate. The metallic tang of blood, the pungent decay of bodies, the acrid smoke of fires where possessions and manuscripts had been burned. German and Lithuanian execution squads moved with mechanical precision, shouting commands, lining up victims, shooting, shoving, burying. Sometimes the victims were killed immediately. Sometimes they were buried alive, convulsing beneath the weight of bodies stacked above them. The screams of those who could be heard were swallowed by the trees, absorbed into the forest floor, leaving nothing but silence for the next group of deportees to enter. Back in the ghetto, those left behind lived in a state of constant anxiety. Every day, another list would be posted or shouted, another group would disappear. Families counted heads obsessively, fearing that a brother, a father, a child would vanish overnight. Every knock at the door, every step along the hall, every voice in the street could herald the arrival of a roundup. Fear was now a language everyone spoke fluently. Children, who had survived the hunger and disease of the first years, were now forced to understand the mechanics of disappearance. They memorized the footsteps of the German patrols, learned where to hide, learned which neighbors could be trusted. By late 1941, the deportations expanded beyond Ponary to Estonia, specifically to labor camps such as Kluga and Vivera. These camps, located hundreds of kilometers from Vilna, were intended to exploit Jewish labor for the German war machine. The journeys were brutal. People were crammed into cattle cars, standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit, with little food, little water, and no sanitation. The smell was unbearable, and the air thickened with heat, sweat, and the stench of human waste. Children were carried when they could not stand. Babies cried endlessly, their mothers straining to comfort them. Those who fell were trampled underfoot. Some succumbed to exhaustion, disease, or dehydration even before arriving at the camps. Upon arrival in Estonia, the conditions were cruelly calculated. The Germans saw no need for comfort, no need for mercy. Tents and barracks were overcrowded, malnourishment widespread, sanitation non-existent. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, influenza, each claimed hundreds within days. Every sick child, every exhausted adult, every weakened elder was a disposable number. Forced labor was grueling, clearing forests, building roads, hauling timber, maintaining railway lines. Mistakes were punished severely, beatings, execution, or forced labor beyond what the body could endure. Those who survived one day were forced to survive the next under the same unyielding conditions. Meanwhile, news of these deportations trickled back into the Vilna Ghetto, carried by those who escaped, returned briefly from work assignments, or whispered by sympathetic locals. The people left behind faced a torment that went beyond hunger or fear, the uncertainty of whether their loved ones were alive, and the horror of imagining what they had endured. Mothers refused to eat in order to save scraps for children, hoping against hope that the food might travel with those deported. Fathers kept silent, their mouths pressed into grim lines, their hands shaking with helpless rage. Families clung to fragments of communication, notes smuggled through contacts, messages hidden in laundry, letters handed surreptitiously. But most information was incomplete, fragmented, terrifying. Despite the despair, daily life had to continue in the ghetto. Workshops still operated, rations still distributed, children still schooled in secret, cultural resistance continued in hidden spaces. These acts were more than survival, they were defiance. Every preserved book, every whispered lesson, every hidden manuscript was a statement that the Germans could take bodies, but they could not take memory, they could not take history, they could not take identity. Yet the deportations created impossible moral dilemmas for the leaders of the ghetto. Jacob Jens, who had already been burdened with impossible decisions, now faced direct pressure from the Germans to provide lists of workers for labor camps. He negotiated where possible, attempting to save those whose labor was deemed valuable. But he also knew that refusal would result in mass killings. Every name submitted was a gamble, every decision an ethical abyss. No choice guaranteed safety. No decision could erase guilt. And in every household, those left behind watched, knowing that survival often required complicity. The psychological impact on the children was profound. Those who remained behind were witnesses to loss on a scale beyond comprehension. They watched friends vanish, siblings disappear, parents dragged away. They learned that life could end in a single morning, in a single forced march, without warning. Some children retreated inward, developing silence and stillness as tools for survival. Others became small smugglers, couriers, or helpers, running messages or smuggling scraps of food to relatives across the fences. Survival became an instinct as precise as breathing, and every act of ingenuity or courage carried the weight of life and death. In Estonia, deportees were subjected to a system that combined relentless labor with psychological torment. Guards moved through the camps with unpredictable cruelty, shouting, beating, killing at whim. Families were separated immediately upon arrival. Children were torn from parents' arms. Elderly and sick were left to die. People were forced to perform tasks that exhausted them physically, mentally, and emotionally. Many died within days. Some lasted months. Each day that a person endured was both victory and torment. And yet, even under this oppression, the human instinct to help persisted. Those who had strength carried water to the weak, shared food, whispered encouragements. Small acts of humanity became acts of defiance. Back in Vilna, the deportations left the ghetto hollowed. Homes were empty. Rooms once filled with laughter and chatter stood silent. Courtyards became grim spaces of fear. Survivors moved like shadows, haunted by the knowledge that anyone could be taken next. The streets, though still crowded with those who remained, were echoes of a world being erased. And the knowledge of Ponary's fate, carried in whispers, rumors, and partial testimonies, made survival an ever-tenuous miracle. Throughout this period, the FPO, the underground resistance, watched the deportations with growing urgency. They understood that armed revolt was still premature, the ghetto was not unified, and any rebellion could trigger wholesale extermination. But they also recognized the necessity of preparation. They trained, gathered intelligence, recruited fighters, and planned escape routes into the surrounding forests. They maintained secrecy at all costs. Every smuggled message, every hidden weapon, every piece of information became a potential lifeline. And they reminded the people of Vilna, quietly, urgently, that the deportations were only a prelude. That Ponary, Estonia, and the death marches were only steps in a carefully orchestrated plan to eradicate the Jewish community. By mid-1942, the ghetto's population had been reduced significantly, the deportations leaving a skeleton of its former self. Survivors faced hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the constant presence of death. But they endured. Every day that the gates remained closed, every night that families slept together in the darkness, every whispered story preserved for the children was a statement that they would not disappear completely. Even as German control tightened, even as Ponary claimed more lives, and Estonia swallowed countless more, cultural and spiritual resistance persisted. It was a fragile resistance, but it was real. Deportations continued intermittently over the following year. Some Jews were selected for labor in Vilna itself, forced to work in factories, workshops, and communal projects. Others were sent deeper into occupied territories, marched to railway stations, packed into cattle cars, and shipped to Estonia, Latvia, or further east. The process was relentless, methodical, terrifying. Families were broken apart. Communities were fragmented. Children were separated from parents. Parents from siblings. Each departure carried the same silent horror. There was no guarantee of return. No expectation of survival. Only the faintest hope, clinging to life like a candle in a storm. And yet, despite the terror, life in the ghetto persisted. Children continued to learn. Artists continued to draw. Musicians continued to play. Teachers continued to teach. And the paper brigade continued its secret work. They documented the names of the deported, chronicled the events, and preserved the cultural heritage under the noses of their oppressors. Survival was not only measured in days or meals, but in memory. To record, to preserve, to resist culturally was to assert life in a world designed to erase it. The deportations from Vilna to Ponary and Estonia illustrate a grim calculus of destruction. Those deemed non-essential were sent to die. Those deemed useful were exploited to prolong the ghetto's function. Children were rarely spared. Families were rarely whole. The acts of survival and resistance were heroic, but terrifyingly fragile. Every day was a gamble, and every act of humanity was a victory against an inhuman system. And as the summer of 1943 approached, the ghetto could sense the tightening noose. Deportations were a rehearsal. Ponary and Estonia were training grounds for annihilation. And the leaders, fighters, and families of Vilna knew that the worst was yet to come. Every march, every truck, every train carried a warning. The final liquidation of the ghetto was drawing near. Those who survived the forced labor, the starvation, the disease, and the shootings understood one truth. Their world, their city, their community was a countdown. And the next chapter would bring the ghetto face to face with its inevitable end. The act of teaching and learning became a lifeline, a structured defiance in a world governed by chaos. Religious education also played a significant role. Hidden prayer groups doubled as classrooms, where children learned Hebrew, Talmudic studies, and the traditions that defined their heritage. Rabbis and elders emphasized the importance of memory, teaching children to recite prayers, recall stories, and preserve rituals. These lessons connected the young to a past that the Nazis were determined to erase. They also provided psychological strength, a framework of order in a world dominated by arbitrary cruelty. The rhythms of prayers, recited silently in basements and attics, became a quiet resistance, a spiritual shield against despair. Artistic education persisted as well, often in secret. Children were taught to draw and paint, to capture the life of the ghetto in sketches, to illustrate what they remembered of Vilna before the occupation. Music lessons, when possible, were conducted with salvaged instruments, violins with broken strings, accordions missing keys, or even improvised percussion. The purpose was both emotional and practical, to sustain morale, to create a record of life in the ghetto, and to provide a means of expression in a place where words and movement were often curtailed. Every sketch, every melody, every song preserved memory in defiance of destruction. One of the most extraordinary aspects of ghetto education was its role in resistance. Children learned not only academics, but also vigilance. They learned to read German commands, to identify threats, to understand when to hide, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Lessons included maps of escape routes, memorized contacts in the forests, and strategies for communication with partisans. The ghetto's young were being prepared, whether they realized it or not, to participate in acts of defiance. Education became intertwined with survival, blending knowledge, cunning, and courage. The secret schools also helped preserve hope. In a place defined by death, learning was a way to assert life. Children recited poems, discussed literature, and shared stories from the past. They imagined futures they might never reach. They celebrated the tiniest victories, completing a lesson, memorizing a poem, solving an arithmetic problem. These small acts of intellectual engagement became crucial for mental survival. Without them, despair might have consumed the ghetto entirely. Teachers and organizers developed a complex system to protect their students. Lessons were scheduled irregularly, locations rotated, and groups divided into smaller units to reduce the risk of detection. Only the most trusted adults knew the full scope of the program. Couriers moved quietly between homes and hidden classrooms, delivering materials and instructions. Some children acted as messengers, carrying secret notes or alerting others to changes in schedule. Every participant understood that discovery could mean instant death, yet the commitment to learning and cultural preservation was unwavering. Despite the risks, the impact of these secret schools was profound. Literacy and learning were maintained in the ghetto, ensuring that when the survivors emerged, they could carry knowledge forward, preserving fragments of Vilna's rich intellectual and cultural heritage. Beyond practical education, the schools reinforced identity, community, and resilience. Children understood that even as the Germans sought to erase them, they were still part of a lineage, a history, a culture that could not be destroyed entirely. Teachers documented lessons, events, and observations, creating records that would later serve as testimony. Diaries, notes, and recollections captured the experiences of children and educators alike, preserving not only knowledge but the human dimension of life under occupation. These documents became a silent form of resistance, a way to ensure that the world would know what had been lost and what had been preserved. The psychological effect on children was both protective and transformative. They gained discipline, critical thinking skills, and a sense of responsibility. They learned to navigate fear and uncertainty, to prioritize, to collaborate, to strategize. These lessons, though born of necessity, nurtured resilience and courage, preparing them for the eventual choices they would face as deportations intensified and the ghetto's destruction accelerated. Education also fostered solidarity. Children shared knowledge, comforted each other, and protected one another from both emotional and physical harm. Peer teaching became a cornerstone of survival, strengthening community bonds and reinforcing the principle that even in the darkest circumstances, cooperation could preserve life and culture. Every recited poem, every copied letter, every whispered lesson was an act of shared defiance. As the ghetto faced increasing deportations to Ponary, Estonia, and beyond, the secret schools became a repository of memory. Children learned not only academics but also history, ethics, and the collective narrative of their people. They memorized events, names, and stories that the Nazis intended to erase. Every lesson became a thread in the tapestry of survival, ensuring that the identity of the Vilna Jewish community would endure even if the physical ghetto was destroyed. Teachers and students alike understood the stakes. Learning was survival, documentation was resistance, and cultural preservation was defiance. Each day spent in secret classrooms was a victory, a declaration that the ghetto's spirit could not be crushed, even as bodies fell to bullets, starvation, and disease. In the end, the secret schools of the Vilna Ghetto were more than classrooms. They were fortresses of memory, havens of hope, and instruments of resistance. They ensured that knowledge, culture, and identity would persist, even in a world designed to annihilate them. The children who emerged from these schools carried not only education, but the courage, resilience, and moral fortitude needed to survive and to testify. And as the deportations, roundups, and executions intensified in the following months, the lessons learned in these hidden classrooms will become tools for survival, for resistance, and for remembering a world that the Nazis sought to erase completely. Every whispered lesson, every memorized poem, every hidden manuscript became a lifeline, a bridge between the ghetto and the future, and a beacon of defiance in a city where death had become the constant companion of life. Chapter 12. The Secret Schools and Education in the Vilna Ghetto. In the midst of starvation, fear, and the ever-present shadow of death, the children of Vilna found a way to keep learning. Education, once taken for granted in the vibrant streets of the Jerusalem of Lithuania, became an act of courage, an act of defiance, an act of survival. Classrooms no longer existed as rooms filled with chalkboards and desks. They existed in basements, in attics, under stairwells, and in any small space where a group of children could huddle together without attracting the attention of German patrols. Every whisper, every lesson plan smuggled in with hope, became a rebellion against the Nazis' plan to erase not just lives, but the very knowledge and culture of the Jewish people. The secret schools of Vilna were improvised, fragile, and constantly under threat. Teachers, who had once lectured in universities or conducted studies in libraries, became clandestine guides. They taught arithmetic on scraps of paper, Yiddish literature from memory, and history through whispered stories of kings, scholars, and heroes. Every lesson was a battle for the mind, a fight to keep the spirit alive in a world that sought to crush it. The students listened intently, often clutching small pieces of chalk or fragments of torn paper to record what they could. There was never enough for everyone, so memorization became essential. Children repeated lessons quietly to each other, passing knowledge from ear to ear like contraband, ensuring that even if the teacher was arrested or killed, the words could live on. The curriculum in these secret schools was determined by necessity as much as by tradition. Basic literacy and arithmetic were prioritized because they were practical, tools for survival and organization within the ghetto. But history, poetry, and literature were equally critical. They reminded children of a world beyond the ghetto walls, a world they had been robbed of, but could imagine through stories. Teachers carefully selected which texts to teach, balancing the need for moral education, cultural continuity, and the maintenance of hope. Each lesson was carefully measured, because discovery by German patrols could mean immediate execution. For the older children, education often became vocational training. Workshops and factories allowed teenagers to learn trades under supervision: tailoring, carpentry, shoemaking, and other skills the Germans deemed useful. These lessons were disguised as forced labor, but they were also essential for survival. A skilled worker was more likely to receive a ration card, less likely to be deported immediately, and able to contribute to the ghetto's fragile infrastructure. Teachers and elders recognized this dual purpose and encouraged students to learn with diligence, even under duress. Education became survival in every sense. Parents played a critical role in sustaining education. Mothers who had once been homemakers became instructors, teaching their children prayers, literacy, and numeracy, while simultaneously tending to infants, cooking meals, and caring for the sick. Fathers who had once been professionals, merchants, or scholars guided their children in moral reasoning and practical skills, teaching them how to navigate the terror that surrounded them. Education was communal, shared, and fiercely protected. Families knew that knowledge could not be taken in the same way food or possessions could. It was invisible, mobile, and deeply personal, a form of resistance the Germans could not confiscate, as long as the students remembered it. The underground education system in the ghetto was incredibly resourceful. Textbooks were rare and often smuggled from libraries or hidden caches. Paper was precious. Ink was limited. Children sometimes wrote lessons in dust on the floors, tracing letters with their fingers. They memorized poetry because the pages had been confiscated. They practiced arithmetic on scraps of wood or the backs of cloth. Even songs were coded, melodies remembered by heart, and passed from child to child. Creativity became essential because each tool, chalk, paper, scrap of wood, whispered verse, was a lifeline, a weapon against oblivion. The act of teaching was dangerous. Teachers risked arrest, deportation, or execution every day. German patrols made rounds unpredictably, and even the smallest noise could draw attention. A child coughing in an attic or footsteps above a hidden classroom could endanger everyone present. Yet teachers persisted, understanding that the education they provided was as critical as any food ration or hidden weapon. Each lesson was a defiance of the Nazis' goals, an assertion that the ghetto would not be silenced. Among the teachers were some of Vilna's most brilliant minds. Former scholars from the Strashen Library, university professors, and artists turned educators guided children with a combination of knowledge, creativity, and courage. They understood that the stakes were higher than passing exams or completing assignments. Every lesson might be the last, every child a potential witness to history, and every act of learning a statement that life, culture, and identity could not be completely destroyed. Children themselves were remarkable in their resilience. They memorized lessons, shared knowledge, and even taught each other when adults were unavailable. Older students took responsibility for younger ones, guiding them through arithmetic, reading, and moral lessons. These peer-led sessions ensured that education continued, even in the absence of formal teachers. Chapter 13: Life and Death in the Second Ghetto. The Second Ghetto of Vilna was not planned, it was forced. The first had been a tenuous attempt at organizing survival, a place where work, fear, and cultural defiance intertwined to create fragile rhythms of daily life. But as the deportations continued, as Ponary and Estonia claimed more victims, as German control tightened, the survivors were forced into an even smaller, harsher space, the Second Ghetto. The walls were higher, the streets narrower, and the air heavier with the smell of overcrowding, sweat, and decay. Every day was a negotiation with death, every breath a reminder that survival was temporary, and every act of life was an act of defiance. When the gates closed, the inhabitants of the second ghetto realized immediately that their world had shrunk to the size of despair. Families that had managed to survive the first wave of deportations were now pressed together in rooms meant for 2 or 3, crammed with 6 or 7, sometimes 10 people. Beds were improvised from floorboards and rags. Kitchens became places of desperation, where a pot of watery cabbage or turnips was divided among dozens. Every meal was a battle against starvation. Parents rationed what little they had, hiding scraps from children to make sure the adults could last, or sharing meager morsels with the youngest, silently praying there would be enough to keep them alive another day. The second ghetto was patrolled constantly. German soldiers and Lithuanian auxiliaries moved through the streets, inspecting every corner, every doorway, every hidden recess. Anyone found hiding, anyone without the proper identification papers, anyone caught stealing a scrap of food or a book could be shot on the spot. The patrols were relentless, the punishments immediate, and the terror omnipresent. Children learned to remain silent at all costs. Mothers whispered to toddlers to stay still and not cry. Fathers pulled older children into shadows, teaching them to read the movements of the soldiers like a language, to anticipate danger, to survive through invisibility. Life in the second ghetto was a relentless cycle of labor and survival. Those with work permits, rare and precious, were forced to report daily to workshops, factories, and construction sites. They repaired roads, built furniture, stitched garments, and performed tasks for the German war machine that had already destroyed their homes, their families, and their neighbors. Work was both a reprieve and a curse, a means to survive another day, but a constant reminder of their subjugation. Those without work permits were left to endure starvation, disease, and despair in the overcrowded apartments. They became dependent on the scraps smuggled in by children and young adults who risked their lives to bring food from outside, crawling under fences, squeezing through gaps, and bribing guards with what little they had. Disease spread with devastating speed. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza became constant threats, preying on the weak and malnourished. The ghetto's makeshift hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors and nurses, themselves exhausted and underfed, worked with whatever supplies they could find. They treated patients with onion poultices, herbal teas, and improvised medicines, desperately trying to slow the inevitable. Many patients died alone in the dark, their cries unheard, their bodies carried out of the rooms by friends or neighbors too weak to help further. Death became as routine as breakfast, a grim companion that shadowed every action, every decision, every breath. Despite these horrors, the inhabitants of the second ghetto refused to surrender their humanity. Secret schools persisted, held in attics, basements, and hidden rooms, teaching children literacy, arithmetic, history, and culture. Music floated softly from improvised instruments. Artists sketched what they saw, documenting the decay, the suffering, but also the moments of quiet courage. Writers recorded diaries, poems, and stories, often at great personal risk. Every act of cultural resistance was a declaration. We are alive, we exist, we remember, and we will not be erased entirely. Food remained the defining struggle. Rations were insufficient, forcing residents to scavenge, barter, and smuggle. Mothers divided scraps to feed children. Fathers scavenged in abandoned buildings or alleyways for potatoes, bread crusts, or any edible scraps. Hunger gnawed at every stomach, hollowing cheeks, weakening muscles, dulling minds. Children learned to stretch a single piece of bread across hours, to share what little they had without complaint. The smell of cooking, or simply of food being carried, could cause entire rooms to grow tense, children clutching their stomachs, hoping for a taste, fearing theft or punishment for attempting to take more than their share. Amid the suffering, the FPO continued its work. The underground resistance trained in secret, moving quietly through the ghetto, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the Germans. They smuggled weapons, communicated with partisans outside, and prepared escape routes into the forests surrounding Vilna. Every act of resistance was a calculated risk. A single mistake could bring down the full force of German retaliation on the ghetto, but doing nothing meant certain death in the long term. The tension between rebellion and survival became the defining struggle of life in the second ghetto. Families were torn apart yet again. The Germans, assisted by Lithuanian collaborators, conducted regular roundups, seizing children, the elderly, and anyone deemed unfit for work. Those taken were sent to Ponary or labor camps in Estonia. The streets echoed with screams, the thud of boots, and the barking of orders. Mothers screamed as children were pulled from their arms. Fathers tried to intervene, only to be beaten. The crowd of bystanders watched silently, powerless to intervene, terrified that any act of defiance would provoke the same fate for themselves. The roundups were designed not only to reduce the population, but also to break morale, to instill the belief that resistance was futile. Even in the face of such brutality, moments of quiet defiance persisted. Secret classrooms continued to operate, artists continued to sketch, musicians continued to play, and writers continued to document. Children memorized lessons and stories, ensuring that knowledge and culture survived even if they did not. Parents encouraged these acts, understanding that education and culture were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Preserving memory became a form of resistance, a refusal to let the Nazis erase the ghetto's identity completely. Hunger, fear, and disease forced residents to make impossible moral choices. Parents had to decide which children could be hidden, which could be smuggled out of the ghetto, and which would have to remain in the perilous confines of the walls. Adults had to choose whom to save when food was scarce. Those with work permits sometimes traded their labor or possessions to protect loved ones. The psychological toll was immense, leaving scars that would last long after liberation. The second ghetto also became a center of spiritual resistance. Rabbis and elders led secret prayer gatherings, teaching children prayers, blessings, and rituals that had been passed down through generations. Families celebrated holidays in secret, marking Passover, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur with whispered prayers and small symbolic acts. Religious observance provided a framework for coping with the omnipresent threat of death and served as a reminder that their faith and culture could not be eradicated. Despite the oppressive conditions, a fragile sense of community persisted. Neighbors shared scarce food, tended to the sick, and protected each other from German scrutiny where possible. Even small acts of kindness, covering a child's feet with a blanket, sharing a stolen potato, or comforting a grieving parent, became acts of resistance, affirming life in a place designed to extinguish it. These gestures helped maintain a sense of dignity and solidarity, even as death lurked at every corner. The FPO continued to prepare for the inevitable. Fighters trained in basements and courtyards, studying maps, practicing with smuggled weapons, and planning potential uprisings or escapes. They coordinated with partisans in the surrounding forests, creating contingency plans for evacuation or sabotage. Every moment spent training was both an act of survival and a symbolic defiance of German control. These preparations fostered hope and determination, even in a ghetto dominated by fear. Children played a critical role in survival and resistance. Older boys and girls smuggled food, delivered messages, and even assisted in hiding weapons. They became adept at moving undetected through the alleys, understanding the patterns of German patrols, and learning the secret routes that could save their lives or the lives of others. Through these acts, the youngest members of the ghetto became not just witnesses, but participants in a struggle for life and dignity. Disease continued to ravage the population. Overcrowding, malnutrition, and poor sanitation created a breeding ground for typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses. Makeshift clinics operated with minimal supplies, and medical personnel worked tirelessly, often succumbing to illness themselves. Every day was a race against the body's weakening defenses. Those who survived 1 week were considered fortunate, but survival provided no guarantee for the next. The ghetto existed as a suspended world, where life and death intertwined so closely that it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. As the second ghetto endured, the psychological toll deepened. Survivors lived with constant dread, knowing that any day could bring a new roundup, a deportation, or an execution. Children grew up too fast, learning to navigate terror with skill and instinct. Adults lived with guilt, helplessness, and grief, forced to make decisions that no human should ever face. Yet amidst the suffering, resilience persisted. Education, cultural preservation, and small acts of defiance provided a framework for survival, both physical and spiritual. The second ghetto was a crucible, testing every aspect of human endurance. Hunger, disease, terror, and constant threat of death shaped behavior, morality, and identity. Those who survived learned to adapt, to anticipate danger, and to find strength in small acts of courage. They preserved knowledge, culture, and community, even as the Germans sought to erase every trace of life, every memory, every story. By late 1943, the second ghetto was nearing its final stages. Deportations had thinned the population, disease had claimed countless lives, and the FPO was preparing for its final acts of resistance. But even as the end approached, the people of Vilna demonstrated remarkable resilience. They continued to educate children, document events, create art, and preserve culture. Every page written, every lesson taught, every song sung, every act of compassion became a testament to the indomitable human spirit. The second ghetto was not just a place of suffering. It was a place where humanity fought to endure. And as the final liquidation loomed, the inhabitants of Vilna, despite exhaustion, grief, and fear, understood one truth. Even in the shadow of annihilation, life, memory, and resistance could persist. And this persistence would shape the legacy of the Vilna Ghetto for generations to come, a testament to courage, culture, and the unbreakable will to survive. Chapter 14. The Final Liquidation. Collapse of the Vilna Ghetto. The morning began like any other, yet it carried the weight of inevitability, a suffocating heaviness that pressed down on every chest, on every step, on every heartbeat in the Vilna Ghetto. Families stirred, not with hope, but with instinctual terror. Mothers clutched children too small to understand the silence that had fallen over the streets. Fathers glanced nervously down alleys, ears straining for the first sound of boots, the bark of orders, the rumble of engines. Something was coming, something final, something the residents had known was coming for months, whispered about in hushed tones, feared at every turn, and yet never fully comprehensible until it arrived. The final liquidation had begun. German soldiers moved swiftly, their boots striking cobblestones in rigid cadence, their rifles slung and ready, their eyes cold and unflinching. Lithuanian auxiliaries flanked them, carrying the weight of complicit brutality as they prodded residents out of homes, dragged them from workshops, tore children from their mothers, and forced entire families into the streets. The cries that erupted were not limited to the ghetto. They echoed in the narrow alleys, bouncing from walls, mixing with the morning fog, creating a soundscape of terror that would linger long after the victims had gone. Every march, every line, every shouted order was a calculated instrument of fear. The Germans wanted obedience. They wanted panic. They wanted destruction. Families were gathered in open courtyards, pressed into lines, shoulders touching shoulders, faces pale, eyes wide. Children clung to parents, not knowing what awaited, but feeling the weight of impending doom in the air. Mothers whispered blessings and prayers, stroking small heads with trembling hands, trying to impart comfort, even as their own fear threatened to overwhelm them. Fathers tried to stand tall, giving orders to themselves and others, instructing children to remain calm, to step lightly, to follow directions. The scene was horrifyingly ordinary, like an everyday morning suddenly transformed into a nightmare. The Judenrat, led by Jacob Jens, was forced to cooperate, writing lists of those who would be sent for resettlement or work. Jens knew the reality behind the euphemisms. He knew that those being selected were walking toward Ponary, toward Estonia, toward death. Every name he wrote, every household he marked, was a life sentence. Yet refusal meant wholesale slaughter, a certainty too terrifying to contemplate. He moved quickly, methodically, his hands shaking beneath the weight of responsibility. The ghetto's residents watched him with suspicion, fear, and resentment, knowing he was their lifeline and their judge, all in one. Trucks arrived, engines growling like hungry beasts, lined up to carry away the doomed. Those selected were forced to march toward them, their footsteps echoing in narrow streets like the drumbeat of mortality. Children cried, mothers screamed, fathers muttered prayers under their breath. Some resisted, refusing to leave their homes, attempting to hide in basements or attics, but the soldiers' rifles and prods ensured compliance. Every attempt at defiance was met with immediate violence, a brutal lesson in the futility of resistance at that moment. The deportations were not only a physical ordeal, but a psychological one. People were forced to abandon belongings, sentimental items, even the most cherished pieces of their past. Photographs, heirlooms, religious texts, personal mementos, all were left behind or confiscated. The ghetto, which had once contained the life and culture of generations, was stripped bare, leaving only bodies, fear, and the oppressive walls that had become both cage and witness. Those taken from the ghetto faced death with a mixture of resignation and desperation. Families held hands tightly as they were shoved into trucks or marched toward trains. Children cried out for parents, their small voices swallowed by the engines, the commands, and the unyielding machinery of Nazi bureaucracy. Some parents whispered comfort, some shouted encouragement, and some fell silent, their faces pale, their bodies rigid with shock. The process was meticulously organized. The Germans wanted efficiency, not chaos. They wanted obedience, not panic, though panic, of course, was impossible to eradicate entirely. As the deportees left, the streets emptied, leaving behind shadows of life. The ghetto shrank, collapsing inward on itself. Buildings that had been filled with families, laughter, and clandestine learning were now empty or half-occupied, the air thick with dust, smoke, and silence. The remaining residents, those too young, too old, or too weak to be marched immediately, watched with dread. Every step of the soldiers, every rumble of the trucks, every scream that drifted through the air was a reminder of the fate that awaited them. Fear became tangible, like a thick fog pressing down on the chest, and hope became a fragile flicker, constantly threatened. Inside the ghetto, cultural resistance and education persisted despite the horror. Teachers gathered children in hidden rooms, whispering lessons in mathematics, Yiddish literature, and history. Musicians played quietly, preserving melodies that connected the present to the past. Writers and diarists documented the events, capturing the terror, the grief, and the small acts of humanity that persisted even in the shadow of death. Each act of learning, each note played, each word written, was defiance, a refusal to let the Nazis erase not only the people but their culture, their memory, their very existence. The FPO continued to operate, though their actions were constrained by the overwhelming presence of German forces. Fighters moved through hidden passages, prepared weapons, and coordinated escape routes into the forests surrounding Vilna. Their mission was impossible. To resist openly would invite slaughter, yet to do nothing was to accept annihilation without protest. They worked silently, training in basements, attics, and secret courtyards, knowing that every moment counted. The knowledge that an uprising might never succeed weighed on them, yet it also hardened their resolve. Deportations to Ponary continued in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Children, the elderly, the sick, and those deemed unfit for labor were separated from families and sent to the forest to be executed. Survivors described the march to Ponary as a surreal nightmare. Soldiers shouted orders, dogs barked, and parents clutched their children, knowing instinctively that this might be the last time they would see them. Those who fell behind, too weak or too afraid to continue, were shot without hesitation. The forest became a cemetery, swallowing families whole, leaving only smoke, screams, and the scent of blood in its wake. For those sent to Estonia, the experience was equally horrifying, though framed as forced labor. Cramped cattle cars transported hundreds of individuals over long distances, often without food, water, or sanitation. The journey itself claimed lives through exhaustion, disease, and sheer deprivation. Upon arrival, prisoners were subjected to grueling work, living in overcrowded barracks with minimal shelter from the elements. Disease spread quickly, starvation was constant, and beatings were frequent. Survival depended on cunning, solidarity, and sheer luck, but even these were no guarantee. Inside the ghetto, those left behind endured constant terror. Every knock at the door, every movement in the streets, every distant shout could signal another roundup. Children learned quickly to hide, to remain silent, to anticipate danger. Parents instructed them in survival strategies, teaching them how to recognize German commands, how to disappear into shadows, how to protect each other. Every day was a negotiation with death, a test of ingenuity and courage. The moral weight of survival was immense. Leaders like Jacob Jens faced impossible choices, balancing the Germans' demands with the desperate hope of preserving life. Each decision carried a cost, and every day presented new ethical dilemmas. Who would live? Who would die? Who could be protected? And who could not? Families grappled with similar dilemmas, deciding whether to hide children, ration food, or risk smuggling someone out of the ghetto. Every act was fraught with consequence, every choice a tightrope over a pit of death. Amidst the terror, the ghetto's cultural and educational efforts persisted. Secret schools continued to operate, passing knowledge from teacher to student, from child to child. Music, art, and literature flourished quietly in hidden spaces, preserving the spirit of the community. Every poem memorized, every story whispered, every sketch drawn was an act of resistance, a claim to life, memory, and identity in a world determined to erase them. The final days of the ghetto were marked by an intensification of deportations, violence, and despair. Families were torn apart with brutal efficiency. Streets once filled with the rhythms of daily life became corridors of fear. Soldiers moved through the remaining residents with rifles ready, shouting orders, driving people into lines, separating parents from children. Even those who had survived previous roundups now faced the ultimate test. The ghetto, already reduced to a fraction of its original population, seemed to shrink further with every passing hour. Children, who had endured hunger, disease, and fear for years, were now forced to witness the total collapse of their world. Many were hidden by parents or older siblings, but the reach of the Germans and their collaborators was relentless. The psychological trauma of these final days would linger long after the gates of the ghetto were broken down, leaving scars that would never fully heal. In this collapse, the FPO prepared for their final acts of resistance. Fighters moved through the remaining buildings, coordinating their plans, distributing weapons, and attempting to communicate with partisans outside the city. They understood that survival was unlikely, yet they persisted, motivated by the need to assert defiance, to die on their own terms, and to preserve a sense of agency in the face of annihilation. Every weapon hidden, every route mapped, every contingency planned was a statement that the ghetto would not be entirely passive. The final liquidation of the Vilna Ghetto was not a single moment, but a series of orchestrated events that unfolded over days. Trucks carried hundreds to Ponary. Marches to assembly points became exercises in terror. Families were torn apart. Screams echoed through narrow streets. And the survivors watched helplessly as those who had once filled their lives with laughter, knowledge, and culture were taken away. The second ghetto, already a fragile shadow of the community it had been, disintegrated under the weight of orchestrated violence. Even in the face of overwhelming destruction, acts of humanity persisted. Neighbors shielded each other, families shared scraps of food, and the remaining cultural resistance continued. Teachers, artists, and writers worked in secret, preserving records, sketching scenes, and documenting events for future generations. Every act of preservation, every gesture of compassion, every scrap of knowledge saved was a refusal to let the Germans erase the community entirely. As the ghetto emptied, silence descended, but it was not peace. The streets, now largely deserted, bore the residue of fear, grief, and horror. Buildings were stripped bare, personal belongings confiscated or destroyed. The remaining residents lived in anticipation of the next round of deportations, understanding that even survival offered no certainty. And the forest of Ponary waited, patient, unyielding, consuming the lives of those taken from the streets and alleyways of Vilna. The final liquidation marked the collapse of a community that had endured over 2 years of starvation, disease, fear, and terror. It was a calculated, methodical extermination designed to erase not only lives, but culture, memory, and identity. Yet the Vilna Ghetto's legacy endured in the survivors, in the hidden archives, in the whispered lessons of children, and in the acts of defiance that had persisted even in the darkest days. The collapse of the ghetto was absolute, but it was not total. Within the ruins, in hidden corners and secret passages, remnants of resistance survived. Diaries, manuscripts, sketches, and music became testimony to what had existed, what had been destroyed, and what could never be forgotten. The streets of Vilna were emptied of bodies, but the memory of the community, their courage, their culture, their defiance, lived on. And as the final transports rolled out, the ghetto fell silent, leaving behind only walls, rubble, and the indelible imprint of a people who had fought to survive, to learn, and to remember, even in the shadow of annihilation. The story of the Vilna Ghetto was nearing its tragic end, but the echoes of its life, death, and defiance would reverberate long after the streets were emptied, ensuring that the world would remember. Chapter 15: Survival, Escape, and the Legacy of Vilna. The streets of Vilna were silent now, but silence does not mean peace. The ghetto had been emptied, its walls crumbling, its homes abandoned, its courtyards littered with remnants of lives interrupted. Those who had once walked these streets, children, mothers, fathers, scholars, musicians, fighters, had been torn from the city in waves of deportation, starvation, and executions. Yet even as the final transports disappeared into the forests, the trains, and the hands of the Nazis, a small number survived. They survived by cunning, by courage, by chance, and by the help of neighbors and strangers willing to risk everything to save a life. Survival became a quiet, constant miracle, a testament to human ingenuity and the stubbornness of hope. Escape was neither easy nor guaranteed. Those who had managed to flee the ghetto often relied on a combination of knowledge, bravery, and pure luck. Some crawled through sewers, their bodies scraping against the damp stone, the smell of waste thick in their nostrils, their hands raw from the effort. Others squeezed through gaps in walls or clambered over rooftops under the cover of darkness, moving silently while soldiers patrolled the streets below. Children held their breath in fear, guided by older siblings or neighbors who whispered instructions through teeth clenched against panic. Every movement was fraught with risk. Every shadow could conceal a German patrol. Every sound could betray them. For many, survival depended on the help of outsiders. Non-Jewish Lithuanians, Poles, and others hid families in attics, basements, barns, or remote homes. They smuggled food, provided false identification papers, and offered guidance to navigate the streets of a city under Nazi control. These acts of courage were dangerous, often punishable by death. Yet they were essential. Without this network of helpers, survival would have been impossible. People learned to trust instinctively, to read faces and gestures, to evaluate every interaction for danger. Each decision carried the weight of life and death. Some survivors joined partisan groups in the forests surrounding Vilna. These groups were a mixture of former ghetto fighters, escapees from other ghettos, Soviet partisans, and local resistance fighters. Life in the forest was grueling. Food was scarce. Shelter was makeshift. Every day brought the threat of German patrols, informers, or collaborators. Yet it was also life, raw, dangerous, and defiant. In the forests, survivors found a measure of agency they had never experienced within the ghetto walls. They could make choices, take risks, and strike back at their oppressors. Each small victory, each successful raid, each rescued comrade became a spark of life and hope. Children who survived faced the most extraordinary challenges. They had grown up under constant fear, yet now they had to navigate a new reality where food was scarce, adults were exhausted, and the forests were dangerous. They became apprentices in survival, learning how to forage, how to avoid patrols, how to move silently, and how to care for the sick and injured. Older children became protectors of the younger ones, teaching them to hide, to be quiet, to ration every crumb of food. Their childhood had been stolen, replaced with the skills of instinctive survival, courage, and resilience. Even those who escaped were haunted by memory. Survivors carried with them the weight of the families, neighbors, and friends who had perished. They remembered the cries at Ponary, the sounds of trucks rumbling through the streets, the faces of children torn from mothers, the executions in the forests and fields outside the city. Guilt and grief became companions, never leaving, shaping every choice, every thought, every action. They had survived, but survival came with a profound cost. The memory of the dead was etched permanently into their souls. Amid this trauma, cultural memory persisted. Survivors carried fragments of the ghetto's intellectual and artistic life with them. Books and manuscripts smuggled out by the paper brigade, melodies played on salvaged instruments, poems and diaries memorized by heart. These cultural artifacts became lifelines, sustaining identity, preserving history, and serving as proof that life had existed in the ghetto, even when death dominated its streets. Writing, music, and art were not luxuries. They were survival, defiance, and testimony. Some survivors returned to Vilna after the war, walking through the ruins of what had once been a vibrant community. The city had been hollowed, its Jewish population almost entirely annihilated. Synagogues had been desecrated or destroyed. Schools, libraries, and theaters had vanished. The Strashen Library, once the jewel of Jewish scholarship, was gone, its books scattered, burned, or stolen. Survivors confronted not only the physical devastation, but the absence of community, the silence where laughter had once existed, the empty streets where stories and songs had filled the air. Yet even in ruins, memory endured. Survivors recorded testimonies, rebuilt archives, and bore witness to the lives that had been stolen. The experiences of survivors varied widely. Some spent years hiding in forests, living with partisans, learning to hunt and fight. Some were sheltered in rural homes, surviving on meager food, moving constantly to avoid discovery. Some were deported to labor camps in Estonia or elsewhere, enduring forced labor, disease, and brutality before escaping or being liberated by advancing Allied or Soviet forces. Every survivor's story was marked by a combination of ingenuity, courage, and sheer chance, and each carried the weight of all who had been lost. Documentation became a central act of survival and defiance. Survivors wrote memoirs, letters, diaries, and reports, detailing what they had seen, experienced, and endured. These accounts preserved the human dimension of the Holocaust, chronicling the lives, culture, and suffering of the Vilna Jewish community. They recorded names, dates, and events, ensuring that the world would remember the victims and honor their legacy. The act of bearing witness was itself a continuation of resistance, ensuring that death could not claim history, identity, or memory. Many survivors joined post-war efforts to preserve cultural artifacts. Manuscripts saved by the paper brigade, diaries, artworks, and personal items became central to documenting the ghetto's life and history. Institutions were established, collections curated, and records preserved for future generations. The legacy of Vilna's intellectual and cultural resistance ensured that, even after annihilation, the story of the ghetto, its people, and their courage would survive. Psychologically, survival demanded adaptation. Trauma shaped behavior, memory, and identity. Survivors learned to navigate fear, to form alliances, to make moral decisions under impossible circumstances. Every decision carried consequences, and every memory carried guilt. Yet resilience persisted. Communities formed among survivors, providing mutual support, sharing stories, and preserving traditions. These networks of care became essential for rebuilding lives, recovering from trauma, and maintaining cultural continuity. The legacy of the Vilna Ghetto is complex. It is a story of suffering, atrocity, and unimaginable loss. But it is also a story of courage, resourcefulness, and resistance, armed and cultural, spiritual, and intellectual. The survivors who escaped, hid, or endured labor camps ensured that the world would know what had been lost. They carried with them not only their lives but the memory, culture, and defiance of a community that had refused to surrender entirely. Children who survived went on to become witnesses, educators, and chroniclers. They testified in courts, contributed to historical research, and shared stories with younger generations. Their survival was not just physical, it was moral, cultural, and historical. Every name remembered, every story told, every artifact preserved became a testament to a people who had endured the impossible. The ghetto's fighters, like the members of the FPO, carried the spirit of defiance forward. Some joined partisan groups after escaping, continuing to fight against the Germans and their collaborators. Their experiences in the ghetto had forged courage, discipline, and resilience. Even in the forests, facing starvation, exposure, and constant danger, they acted as if the ghetto's memory itself demanded resistance. Each battle, each act of sabotage, each rescue was tied to the legacy of those who had perished in the streets and forests of Vilna. Survivors also grappled with the ethical dilemmas imposed by life in the ghetto. Choices made under duress: who to save, who to protect, how to navigate cooperation and resistance, left enduring psychological scars. Many wrestled with guilt over lives lost, believing that their survival had come at the expense of others. Yet this same guilt often fueled acts of preservation, testimony, and cultural safeguarding, transforming trauma into a commitment to memory and justice. The physical destruction of the ghetto contrasted sharply with the enduring nature of its cultural and intellectual life. The schools, clandestine libraries, secret manuscripts, diaries, art, and music had created an invisible legacy. Even as buildings crumbled and streets emptied, the ideas, knowledge, and expressions of Vilna's Jewish community survived, carried by those who fled, hid, or endured. This legacy ensured that Vilna's cultural contributions would not vanish, and that the experiences of those who suffered would not be forgotten. The story of survival in Vilna was not just about avoiding death. It was about preserving humanity. People clung to ritual, to faith, to education, to art, and to solidarity. They protected each other when possible, shared what little they had, and risked their lives to save the vulnerable. These acts, though small in the face of overwhelming violence, were monumental in their significance. They were declarations that even under the most brutal oppression, human dignity, culture, and identity could persist. In the months and years following liberation, survivors returned to Vilna when possible, bearing witness to the city's destruction. They worked to rebuild archives, document atrocities, and preserve cultural treasures salvaged by the Paper Brigade and others. Their testimony informed history, ensuring that future generations would understand both the horrors and the courage of life in the Vilna Ghetto. Every diary, manuscript, drawing, and song became a fragment of memory, a tool for education, and a reminder of resilience in the face of systematic destruction. The legacy of the Vilna Ghetto endures in multiple dimensions: the stories of survival, the records of resistance, the preservation of culture, and the courage of individuals who refuse to surrender. It is a testament to the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to resist, even when the forces aligned against life and dignity seem insurmountable. Those who survived carried with them the memory of families, neighbors, and friends lost, and transformed that memory into testimony, education, and cultural preservation. Vilna's ghetto was annihilated physically, but the spirit of its people survived. Every manuscript saved, every secret lesson taught, every act of defiance, small or large, contributed to a legacy that would outlast the ruins. The survivors became witnesses, educators, and guardians of memory, ensuring that the world would remember the city, the ghetto, and the people who had lived, suffered, resisted, and, against impossible odds, survived. The Vilna Ghetto story ends not with the gates of its destruction, but with the lives that endured beyond them. Survival was not merely escaping death. It was preserving memory, culture, and humanity. It was transforming trauma into testimony. And it was asserting, in the face of systematic annihilation, that a people could not be erased entirely. The streets may have been emptied, the walls destroyed, and the voices silenced, but the spirit of Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, lived on in every survivor, every story recorded, and every memory preserved for generations to come.